The sea is always present here at the Eddystone Rocks, 14 miles out from the shelter of Plymouth Sound. You do not see the sea so much as you hear it and feel it, a steady, heavy presence that presses against the base of the tower, in a rhythm older than memory. The tower itself is a column of interlocking granite blocks fitted together with such precision that the joints are nearly invisible, a testament to the careful work of men who understood stone and water and the weight of wind. The year is 1824, and the season is turning toward the darker months when the Atlantic gathers its strength and sends long trains of swell rolling up from the southwest. Inside the tower there is a particular stillness that exists nowhere else, a hush created by walls 3 feet thick at the base tapering upward to the lantern gallery 50 feet above the rock. You have been the assistant keeper here for a span of time measured not in calendar months, but in the slow accumulation of routines that mark the life of a light station. The stairs you climb are worn smooth by the passage of many feet over the decades since the tower was first lit. Each granite step hollowed slightly in the center, where boots land in the same place, day after day. The spiral curves upward through the storeroom where barrels of oil wait in the cool dimness, past the living quarters with their simple wooden furniture and the small iron stove that provides the only heat, and onward into the service room where the clockwork mechanism resides. The air changes as you ascend, growing cooler and carrying the faint mineral smell of damp stone mingled with the particular scent of brass and spermaceti oil that clings to everything in a lighthouse. The great storm of 1824 has not yet arrived, but the signs are there for anyone who knows how to read them. The barometer mounted on the wall of the service room shows a steady decline that began in the early hours before dawn, a slow, deliberate fall that speaks of a deep disturbance far out over the western approaches. The wind has shifted to the southwest, and its voice has changed from the usual moan around the gallery to something with more intention behind it. A long, sustained note that rises and falls but never quite drops away entirely. The sea is beginning to show streaks of white far out beyond the reef, and the waves that crash against the rocks send spray higher than usual against the base of the tower where the granite is dark with perpetual wetness. The Fresnel lens in the lantern room above is the reason for your presence on this particular watch. It is a remarkable assembly of brass rings and thick glass prisms arranged in a precise geometric pattern around a central light source, a device that captures the yellow flame of the argand lamp and bends it into a beam that reaches 20 miles across the water. The lens was installed not long ago, and it requires a level of attention that the old reflectors never demanded, a daily ritual of inspection and cleaning that falls to the assistant keeper during the hours between midnight and dawn when the principal keeper rests below. The glass surfaces must be kept absolutely clear of any film or haze because even the thinnest layer of residue can scatter the light and reduce the range of the beam, a matter of consequence for the ships that navigate these dangerous waters. You have assembled the necessary items on a small wooden tray in the service room before climbing the final set of steps to the lantern. There is a jar of jeweler's rouge, a fine red powder that will be mixed with a small amount of spirits of wine to create a thin paste suitable for polishing brass and glass without scratching the surface. There are several squares of soft cotton cloth cut from old linen and washed many times until they are free of any coarse fibers that might leave marks on the prisms. There is a chamois leather kept in a tin box to protect it from damp, reserved for the final buffing that removes the last trace of polish and leaves the glass perfectly transparent. The tools of this work are simple, but the work itself requires patience and a steady hand, and an understanding that nothing in a lighthouse can be rushed. The lantern room is a circular space enclosed by tall panes of thick glass set into iron frames that have been painted and repainted over the years to protect against the relentless salt air. The central pedestal rises from the floor like the trunk of a mechanical tree supporting the great lens assembly that dominates the room. The lens is a thing of surprising beauty when you stand close to it, a tiered arrangement of brass rings and triangular glass prisms that catch the light from the lamp and hold it for a moment before sending it outward in the precise horizontal plane required for navigation. The prisms are arranged in bands around the central drum, some curved like the eye of a bull, others angled to gather light that would otherwise escape upward and redirect it into the main beam. The entire assembly floats on a bath of mercury contained in a circular trough at its base, a detail of engineering that allows tons of brass and glass to rotate with the pressure of a single finger against the carriage. The lamp itself burns at the center of the lens, a complex argand burner with multiple concentric wicks that draw oil upward through capillary action and produce a flame of remarkable brightness and steadiness. The flame breathes through a system of air passages, and the heated exhaust rises through a copper funnel to the ventilating cowl in the roof. A constant quiet draft that keeps the glass from fogging and carries away the products of combustion. The smell of burning oil is faint but ever present in the lantern room, mingling with the metallic scent of brass and the clean sharpness of the sea air that finds its way through every gap and seam. The light from the flame passes through the prisms and emerges transformed, a solid beam of radiance that rotates slowly across the dark water, marking the rhythm of the Eddystone for any vessel within sight. You begin the work of this watch by examining the lens in the dim illumination of the lamp itself, augmented by a small hand lantern that you have brought up from below. The glass surfaces are not dirty in the ordinary sense of household dust or window grime, but they have acquired a fine, almost invisible film that forms from the combination of salt particles carried on the sea air and the faint residue of oil vapor that escapes from the lamp despite the careful ventilation. This film catches the light in a particular way that the trained eye can detect. A slight milkiness that softens the sharp edges of the prism facets and reduces the crystalline clarity that is the mark of a properly maintained Fresnel lens. The brass rings and frames have dulled slightly as well, taking on a muted mustard tone rather than the bright golden gleam that comes from regular polishing. You pour a small measure of spirits of wine into a shallow dish and add a pinch of the rouge powder, stirring it with a wooden stick until the mixture forms a thin paste, the color of dried brick. The cotton rag is folded into a neat pad and dampened with the paste, taking care not to use too much, because excess polish can work its way into the narrow gaps between prisms and require tedious cleaning with a soft brush. The motion of polishing is a slow circular sweep that begins at the top of the central bullseye panel and moves downward in overlapping arcs, covering every portion of the glass surface. The pressure must be even and consistent, neither too heavy nor too light, a touch that comes only from practice and the muscle memory built over many watches spent in this same room performing this same task. The wind outside continues to build as you work, and its voice against the glass panes rises from a low murmur to a steady, urgent hum. The storm that will be remembered for its ferocity along the entire south coast from Cornwall to Kent is still hours away, but the early signs are unmistakable to anyone who has spent time on the Eddystone rocks. The sea has lost the regular pattern of swell and is becoming a chaotic surface of crossing waves and whitecaps that gleam faintly in the darkness beyond the beam of the light. The tower responds to the increasing pressure with a series of faint vibrations that you feel through the soles of your boots, a subtle tremor that runs up through the granite blocks and into the iron framework of the lantern room. These vibrations are not alarming, but rather a familiar part of life on the reef, a reminder that the tower is built to flex slightly under the immense loads imposed by wind and wave. The polishing of the central bullseye panel takes time, measured not by a clock, but by the slow progress of the rag across the curved surface. You work methodically from top to bottom, from left to right, ensuring that no portion of the glass is missed. The rouge paste dries to a faint pink haze on the surface, and you pause occasionally to inspect the work, using the light of the hand lantern held at a low angle to reveal any streaks or mist spots. The glass begins to show its true character as the film is removed, a deep clarity that seems to hold light within its thickness rather than merely transmitting it. The prisms are made of a special glass formulated to have minimal color distortion, and when perfectly clean they reveal the warm amber glow of the lamp, without any of the greenish or bluish tints that appear in lesser materials. The brass rings that hold the prisms in place require attention as well, and you use a separate cloth with a slightly heavier application of rouge to work the polish into the crevices and around the delicate adjusting screws that allow the lens to be aligned with the horizon. The brass responds quickly to the polishing, taking on a warm, luminous sheen that contrasts with the darker patina of the unpolished areas. The smell of the rouge and spirits mingles with the other scents of the lantern room, creating a particular combination that you've come to associate with the quiet hours of the night watch, when the world outside is reduced to wind and water and the steady rotation of the light. The barometer has fallen further by the time you move from the central bullseye to the upper prisms that crown the lens assembly. These smaller glass elements catch the light that spills upward from the lamp and bend it back down to join the main beam. A clever arrangement that increases the efficiency of the system by reclaiming light that would otherwise be lost to the sky. The upper prisms are more difficult to polish because of their smaller size and the narrow spaces between them, where the brass framework creates a complex geometry of angles and shadows. You use the corner of the rag folded into a precise point to reach into these gaps, applying the rouge with care and then removing it with the same attention to detail. The work is slow and repetitive, and this is precisely what makes it suitable for the night watch, a task that occupies the hands while leaving the mind free to drift in the way that promotes a calm wakefulness. The tower has many sounds that become noticeable only when you are still and quiet. There is the creak of the roof lead expanding and contracting with the temperature changes brought by the wind, a sound like distant footsteps crossing the ceiling above your head. There is the rattle of the ventilating cowl as it turns to face the wind, maintaining the draft that feeds the lamp and carries away the heat. There is the faint tick of the clockwork mechanism in the service room below, transmitted upward through the iron pedestal and into the floor of the lantern room, a steady metronomic beat that marks the rotation of the lens carriage. And beneath all these, there is the deeper sound of the reef itself, a low grinding rumble that is felt more than heard as the heavy seas begin to move the smaller rocks and boulders in the shallows around the tower's base. The great storm of 1824 will bring waves of a height that has rarely been recorded on this coast, and the Eddystone Tower will be tested in ways that its builder could only imagine. But for now, in the quiet of the lantern room, with the wind rising and the barometer falling and the rouge paste drying on the glass, there is only the work and the light and the slow rotation of the lens. You continue polishing the upper prisms one by one, moving around the circumference of the assembly with a patience that comes from understanding the purpose of the task. The ships that pass this way in the darkness rely on the clarity of this beam and the regularity of its flash, and that knowledge sits quietly in the back of your mind without urgency or anxiety, simply a fact of the duty that you have accepted. The glass panes of the lantern room itself need attention as well, though this is a separate task from the lens polishing. The salt spray that is beginning to be carried on the increasing wind leaves a fine crust on the exterior of the panes that cannot be cleaned until the weather moderates, but the interior surfaces can be wiped down to prevent the accumulation of condensation that might drip onto the brass or the lamp. You take a dry cloth and pass it over the inside of the tall windows, moving slowly around the circular room with the same methodical care that you apply to the lens. The view through the glass is of darkness, and the occasional white flash of a breaking wave caught in the edge of the light beam, a glimpse of the power that is gathering out there in the night. The oil level in the lamp reservoir requires checking at regular intervals, and you note the position of the float through the small glass gauge on the side of the tank. The lamp burns approximately 1 gallon of oil per hour under normal conditions, and the reservoir holds enough for an entire night, though in stormy weather, when the flame is turned up slightly to ensure maximum visibility, the consumption increases by a small amount. The principal keeper will bring up additional oil from the storeroom when he relieves you at dawn, and this simple logistical calculation is part of the constant background awareness that shapes life on a rock station where every resource must be managed with care. The upper prisms are finished now, and you step back from the lens to assess the work in the combined light of the lamp and the hand lantern. The glass has that particular quality of transparency that seems almost invisible, as if there is nothing between the flame and the eye except air. The brass fittings gleam softly in the amber glow, and the entire assembly has the appearance of a precision instrument maintained to the highest standard, which it is. The rouge residue that remains on the glass is faint and even, and will be removed in the final buffing with the chamois leather. But that step comes later, after you've attended to the lower prisms that direct light downward to illuminate the reef directly below the tower. The lower prisms are arranged in a ring around the base of the lens assembly, angled to catch light that would otherwise fall uselessly onto the lantern floor and send it outward at a steep downward angle. This light serves a different purpose than the main beam, not for distant navigation but for warning vessels that have come too close to the rocks, a final visual alert that danger is immediate and present. The lower prisms collect more salt film than the upper sections because of their position near the floor where spray and condensation tend to settle, and they require a thorough cleaning each night. You kneel on the wooden deck with the rag and the rouge paste, working your way around the circle of glass triangles and brass frames. The position awkward but familiar after many watches spent in this same posture. The wind has risen to a steady roar now, and the tower trembles with a new frequency that corresponds to the larger waves beginning to arrive from the deep water. The sound of the sea against the rock is a constant thunder punctuated by the heavier impacts that make the lantern glass vibrate in its frames. Inside the tower, the warmth from the lamp and the thick stone walls creates a pocket of relative calm. Though the noise is inescapable, a blanket of sound that wraps around everything and becomes after a while simply the background against which all other sensations are measured. You continue polishing the lower prisms without hurry and without pause, because the work has its own rhythm, and the storm will do what storms do regardless of any human concern. The final section of the lower ring is completed, and you rise slowly, stretching muscles that have grown stiff from kneeling on the hard deck. The lens now has a uniform haze of dried rouge across all its glass surfaces, waiting for the final buffing that'll remove the last trace of polish and leave the prisms absolutely clear. You set aside the rouge and the spirits and take up the chamois leather from its tin box, feeling the soft suited texture that is ideal for this final step. The chamois is used dry and the motion is lighter than before, a gentle wiping that picks up the dried rouge particles and leaves the glass gleaming. You work around the lens from top to bottom once more, the leather gliding over the prisms with a faint squeaking sound that indicates perfect cleanliness. The barometer has stabilized at a very low reading by the time the buffing is complete, and the storm is fully upon the Eddystone rocks. The waves are now striking the tower with enough force to send heavy spray against the lantern glass 50 feet above the normal water level. Sudden curtains of white water that obscure the view and make the interior of the room seem darker for a moment before the light reasserts itself. The lens continues its slow rotation, floating on its mercury bath with a silence that seems remarkable given the weight of the assembly and the violence of the conditions outside. You stand near the pedestal watching the beam sweep across the darkness, and there is a particular satisfaction in knowing that the glass is clean and the light is reaching as far as it possibly can through the salt and the spray and the driving wind. The principal keeper will wake in a few hours and climb the stairs to relieve you, and the routine will continue as it has through every storm that has tested this tower since it was first built. The polishing will need to be done again tomorrow night and the night after that, because the salt film never stops accumulating and the light must never be diminished. But for this watch, the work is done and the lens is clear, and the only thing required now is to remain awake and attentive while the storm spends its fury against the granite walls. You settle onto the small wooden stool near the mechanism where you can see both the lamp and the barometer and the slowly turning lens, and you listen to the wind and the sea and the steady tick of the clockwork, waiting for the grey light of dawn to appear above the eastern horizon. The morning arrives without drama or announcement, a slow change in the quality of the darkness rather than a sudden brightening of the sky. Through the salt streaked glass of the lantern room, the eastern horizon reveals itself as a narrow band of pewter grey squeezed between the black water and the heavier black of the cloud ceiling that presses down upon the sea like a lid on a pot. The storm is still gathering its full strength far out in the western approaches, where the Atlantic stretches unbroken toward the distant shores of the Americas, and what reaches the Eddystone rocks on this particular morning is merely the leading edge of the weather, a forerunner of what will come when the main body of the gale arrives sometime in the night. The wind has settled into a steady note that rises and falls in long, slow cycles, a sustained moan around the gallery and through the iron framework of the lantern that speaks of great volumes of air moving across the open water without obstruction. You remain on the small wooden stool near the clockwork mechanism, your watch not yet complete, though the grey light of dawn has begun to dilute the sharp contrast between the yellow beam of the lamp and the surrounding darkness. The principal keeper will climb the stairs soon to relieve you and take over the daytime duties while you rest in the lower quarters. But for now the lantern room is yours, and the lens continues its silent rotation on its bath of mercury, the prisms you polished during the night still gleaming with a particular clarity that comes from careful attention. The chamois leather has been returned to its tin box, and the rouge paste has been wiped away and the cotton rags have been folded and placed in the small basket where soiled cloths await washing in fresh water when the weather permits a trip to the lower landing stage. A task that will not happen today or likely tomorrow, given the direction and strength of the wind. The barometer on the wall of the service room below has fallen further during the hours of your watch, and you noted the reading when you passed through on your way to check the oil level in the storage barrels, a routine inspection that is part of the assistant keeper's responsibility during the night. The mercury column now sits at a depth that indicates a storm of considerable energy, and the glass tube seems to tremble slightly with each gust of wind that shakes the tower, though this may be only an illusion created by the flickering light of the hand lantern you carry. The principal keeper, a man of many years at sea and on rock stations, will read the same instrument when he rises, and he will nod once to himself before going about the business of securing anything that might be loose in the lower rooms, a precaution born of experience with the way that storms can find the smallest unsecured object and send it clattering across the floor. The climb down the spiral stairs from the lantern room to the living quarters is a journey through layers of temperature and sound and smell, each level of the tower possessing its own distinct character that you have come to know as intimately as the rooms of a childhood home. The lantern room is cold and bright and filled with the smell of hot oil and brass and the constant rush of wind against glass. The service room immediately below is slightly warmer because of the heat that rises through the floor from the stove in the kitchen, and it carries the scent of the clockwork mechanism, a combination of iron and fine machine oil and the faint ozone smell that comes from the friction of moving parts. The living quarters are warmer still, a pocket of human comfort carved out of the granite column, and they smell of coal smoke and cooked food, and the particular mustiness of wool blankets and oilskins hung to dry near the stove. You descend slowly, because the stairs are steep, and the handrail is cold iron, worn smooth by the grip of many hands over the decades since the tower was first lit. Each step has a slight hollow in its center where boots have landed in exactly the same place, thousands upon thousands of times, a small detail that speaks to the repetitive nature of life on a rock station where every movement follows patterns established long before you arrived and will continue long after you have gone. The sound of your boots on the stone is muffled by the roar of the wind outside, which penetrates the thick walls as a constant low hum, a presence that never leaves you even in the innermost rooms where the granite is at its thickest. The principal keeper is already awake when you reach the kitchen level, a small room fitted with the iron stove and a wooden table and a few chairs and shelves, holding the simple provisions that sustain life on the reef. He sits at the table with a cup of tea steaming in his hands, and he looks up when you enter with the expression of a man who has been listening to the wind and drawing conclusions from its voice. The two of you do not exchange many words because there is little need for conversation between people who have shared the same confined space through many watches and many storms, a comfortable silence that comes from familiarity rather than any lack of regard. You tell him that the lens is clean and the lamp is burning well and the oil level is adequate for the day, and he nods once and says that the barometer is falling faster than he has seen in some years, a statement delivered without alarm but with the weight of observation. The morning routine continues in its familiar pattern, a sequence of small actions that mark the transition from night watch to day watch. You prepare your own cup of tea using water from the kettle that sits permanently on the warm corner of the stove, the same kettle that has provided hot water for countless cups of tea through countless storms and calms alike. The tea is strong and dark, and you drink it while standing near the small window that faces roughly east, though the view through the thick glass and the driving spray is little more than a shifting grey blur, the sea and sky merged into a single turbulent medium without clear boundary or horizon. The warmth of the stove seeps into your back, and the warmth of the tea spreads through your chest, and for a moment the storm outside seems distant, a thing happening in another world entirely. The principal keeper rises and begins his own preparations for the day, pulling on an extra layer of wool beneath his oilskin coat before climbing to the lantern room to take over the watch. He will check the lamp and the lens and the mechanism, and he will note any changes in the weather that occur during the daylight hours, though in a storm of this magnitude there is little to be done except wait and maintain and trust in the weight of the granite blocks that form the tower's walls. The assistant keeper's duty during the day is to rest and to be ready for the night watch that will begin again when darkness falls, a cycle that repeats without variation regardless of the conditions outside. You finish your tea, and move to the small sleeping berth built into the curve of the wall, a narrow wooden platform with a thin mattress and wool blankets that hold the faint smell of lanolin and the sea. The berth is arranged so that your head lies toward the center of the tower and your feet point toward the outer wall, where the granite is cool even in summer, and you can feel the vibration of the wind through the stone as a faint tremor that travels up through the mattress and into your bones. Sleep comes not easily, but inevitably, because the body knows its requirements and the mind learns to filter out the constant noise of the storm, categorizing it as background rather than disturbance. The sound of the wind becomes a kind of blanket itself, a continuous presence that wraps around consciousness and gently presses it downward into rest. The hours of daylight pass while you sleep, and the storm continues to build its strength out over the water, drawing energy from the temperature difference between the warm Gulf Stream and the colder air that is swept down from the north. The wind velocity increases by small increments that are barely noticeable from one moment to the next, but which accumulate over the course of the day into a force that begins to test the tower in new ways. The waves grow taller and steeper as they approach the shallow water around the reef, their smooth backs becoming marbled with streaks of foam that are torn away by the wind and driven horizontally across the surface. The Eddystone rocks themselves are visible only as intermittent black shapes in the chaos of white water, appearing and disappearing as the larger waves sweep over them and then recede. When you wake in the early afternoon, the change in the storm's character is immediately apparent, even before you open your eyes. The vibration through the stone has deepened and slowed, a long-period oscillation that corresponds to the larger waves now arriving from the deep water, and the sound of the wind has risen from a moan to a steady roar that fills every corner of the tower with its presence. You lie in the berth for a time listening to these signals and assembling a mental picture of the conditions outside, a skill that develops naturally in anyone who spends enough time on a rock station where the view from the windows is often obscured by spray and the only reliable information comes through the stone itself. The principal keeper has been busy during the hours of your sleep, and you find evidence of his work when you rise and move through the lower rooms. The loose items that normally sit on shelves and tables have been stowed in cupboards or secured with lengths of cord, a precaution against the sudden lurches that can occur when a particularly large wave strikes the tower at an unexpected angle. The storm shutters on the leeward windows have been closed and latched, though the windward windows were already sealed against the weather, their thick glass set deep into the granite and protected by iron bars on the exterior. The stove has been stoked and the kettle sits in its accustomed place, and there is a covered pot of something warm on the back of the cooking surface, a simple meal prepared in anticipation of your waking. You eat standing at the window that faces roughly north toward the distant coast of Devon, though there is nothing to see except the racing grey clouds and the occasional white burst of spray that rises higher than the tower's base. The food is warm and simple, and it serves its purpose of restoring the energy that will be needed for the long night watch ahead, a watch that promises to be more demanding than the previous one given the conditions that are developing outside. The principal keeper will remain in the lantern room until darkness falls, and then you will climb the stairs again to take over the duty while he rests below, a division of labor that has proven effective through many storms and many seasons. The afternoon passes slowly, in the way that time passes during a storm at sea, each hour marked by small tasks and small observations rather than by any significant change in the conditions. You occupy yourself with the minor duties that fall to the assistant keeper during daylight hours, when the weather prevents any work outside on the gallery or the landing stage. The oil stores are checked and the barrels are rotated so that the oldest oil is used first, a practice that prevents spoilage and ensures that the lamp always burns with the brightest possible flame. The wicks for the spare lamp are inspected and trimmed to the proper length and shape, their cotton fibers arranged to draw oil evenly and produce a flame without smoky edges or uneven brightness. The tools used for polishing the lens are cleaned and laid out in preparation for the night's work. The cotton rags and the chamois leather and the small jar of rouge powder all placed in their accustomed positions on the wooden tray. The clockwork mechanism in the service room requires winding every few hours, and you attend to this duty in the mid-afternoon, climbing the stairs past the living quarters and into the room where the great weight hangs in its shaft. The mechanism is a masterpiece of 19th century engineering, a system of gears and escapements that converts the steady descent of a heavy stone weight into the slow, precise rotation of the lens carriage above. Winding the clock involves turning a large crank that raises the weight back to the top of its travel, a task that requires a certain amount of physical effort, but which is made easier by the gearing that multiplies the force applied to the handle. The sound of the crank is a rhythmic clicking that rises above the roar of the wind for the few minutes it takes to complete the winding, and then the mechanism settles back into its steady tick, the escapement releasing one tooth at a time with a precision that has been calibrated to rotate the lens exactly once every 4 minutes. The mercury float that supports the lens is visible through a small inspection port in the side of the pedestal, and you check it as part of the winding routine, ensuring that the silvery pool remains at the proper level and that no foreign matter has found its way into the trough. The mercury is heavy and dense, and it provides a nearly frictionless bearing for the rotating carriage, allowing the great weight of brass and glass to turn with a smoothness that would be impossible with conventional bearings. The surface of the mercury is perfectly still, despite the vibration of the tower, a small pool of liquid metal that reflects the light from your hand lantern with a strange bluish gleam. And watching it for a moment, you are reminded of the cleverness of the men who designed this system and the care they took to ensure that the light would never fail. The wind continues to strengthen as the afternoon wears on toward evening, and the barometer in the service room shows no sign of leveling off, its mercury column still falling in small increments that correspond to the deepening of the low-pressure system out over the Atlantic. The principal keeper descends briefly from the lantern room to eat, and to report that the sea is beginning to show waves of a size that he has rarely witnessed in his years on the Eddystone. Great moving hills of water that rise up from the southwest and break against the reef with a force that makes the entire tower shudder. He says this in the same tone of voice he might use to describe the arrival of a supply boat, calm and matter-of-fact, because there is nothing to be gained by excitement or alarm in a place where the only response to danger is to continue doing what must be done. The light outside is beginning to fade by the time you prepare to begin your night watch, the grey of the storm clouds deepening toward the particular darkness that comes when the sun sets behind a thick overcast. You dress in the warm clothing that will be needed in the lantern room, where the temperature will drop as the night progresses and the wind draws heat away through the glass and the iron framework. Wool against the skin and wool over that, and the oilskin coat that sheds the spray that will inevitably find its way through the seams around the door and the ventilation openings. The climb up the spiral stairs is familiar in the way that all things become familiar with sufficient repetition, each step known by the feel of the stone under your boots and the sound that the iron railing makes when your hand slides along its length. The lantern room is bright with the light of the lamp which the principal keeper has been tending through the afternoon, and which now burns with a steady yellow flame at the heart of the Fresnel lens. The lens rotates in its silent circle, casting the beam outward through the storm with a regularity that has not faltered since the tower was first lit, a fixed point of reference in a world that has otherwise dissolved into wind and water and darkness. The principal keeper nods to you as he prepares to descend, and he says only that the lens is clean enough for now, but will need attention before morning, a statement that you understand to mean that the salt film is already beginning to form on the glass, despite the protection of the lantern room. You take up your position near the mechanism, and you watch the beams sweep across the darkness, and you listen to the wind and the sea and the steady tick of the escapement, and you wait for the night to deepen and the storm to reach its full expression. The polishing rags and the rouge jar wait on their wooden tray, and the chamois leather rests in its tin box, and the work of the watch will begin soon enough. The slow, repetitive task of maintaining clarity in the midst of chaos. The quiet duty of the assistant keeper on the Eddystone rocks during the great storm of 1824. The work of polishing the Fresnel lens is a task that occupies the hands while leaving the mind free to drift in the quiet spaces between observations. And on this particular night, with the storm pressing its full weight against the granite walls of the Eddystone Tower, the drifting quality is more pronounced than usual. The lantern room exists in a state of suspended time, a bubble of amber light and warm brass suspended 50 feet above the reef while the Atlantic heaves and roars against the rock below. The lens rotates with its silent perfection on the mercury float, the great bullseye panels sweeping past the fixed mark on the floor every 4 minutes with a regularity that serves as the heartbeat of the watch, and your task is to ensure that every glass surface remains absolutely clear so that the beam can reach as far as possible through the salt-laden darkness. The wooden tray that holds your polishing supplies sits on the floor near the pedestal, where you placed it upon arriving for the night watch. The items are arranged in the order of their use, a small ritual of preparation that makes the work flow smoothly without wasted motion or unnecessary searching. The jar of jeweler's rouge sits at the left, a heavy glass container with a cork stopper that has been fitted with a small wooden knob for easy removal. The rouge itself is a fine powder, the color of old brick dust, composed of ferric oxide that has been ground to an impalpable fineness, and it has the peculiar property of being soft enough not to scratch the glass while being hard enough to remove the thin film of salt and oil residue that accumulates on the prisms. The spirits of wine stands next to the rouge in a smaller bottle with a glass stopper ground to fit perfectly, preventing evaporation of the volatile liquid. Several squares of soft cotton cloth have been cut from worn linen sheeting and washed repeatedly until the fibers have lost all their coarse stiffness, and these are folded into neat pads and stacked to the right side of the tray. The chamois leather occupies its own tin box, lined with a scrap of oiled paper to keep it supple and free from the damp that permeates everything in a lighthouse. You begin by pouring a small measure of spirits of wine into the shallow dish that serves as your mixing vessel, a ceramic saucer with a slight depression in its center that has been used for this purpose through many watches before yours. The amount is modest because only a thin paste is required and any excess would simply dry out before it could be applied, a waste of materials that are brought to the rock at considerable effort and expense. The rouge powder is added in small pinches, stirred into the spirits with the end of a wooden matchstick that has been trimmed clean of its chemical head, a simple tool that serves the purpose perfectly. The mixture turns a deep pinkish brown as the powder incorporates into the liquid, and the consistency is adjusted by adding either more spirits or more rouge until the paste reaches the proper thickness, thin enough to spread evenly, but thick enough to remain on the rag without dripping. The smell of the spirits rises from the saucer, a clean, sharp scent that cuts through the heavier odors of hot oil and brass and damp wool, and it brings with it a momentary sense of clarity, a brief sharpening of the senses before the long, slow work begins. The first rag is folded into a pad roughly the size of your palm and dampened with the rouge paste applied to one face of the folded square. Too much polish on the rag would work its way into the narrow gaps between the prisms where it would harden and require tedious removal with a soft brush, so you press the pad against the side of the saucer to remove any excess, leaving only a thin, even coating that will transfer to the glass in the sweeping motions of the polishing stroke. The central bullseye panel of the lens is the largest single glass element in the assembly, and it receives the most attention because it handles the greatest portion of the light that forms the main beam. The panel is curved in a precise geometry that focuses the divergent rays from the lamp into a parallel beam, and its surface must be maintained with a clarity that approaches perfection. You begin at the top of the bullseye panel, where the curved glass meets the brass ring that holds it in place. The motion is a slow, circular sweep that moves downward in overlapping arcs, each pass covering a portion of the surface and blending into the next pass without leaving visible boundaries. The pressure must be even and consistent, firm enough to work the rouge into the microscopic film that coats the glass but light enough to avoid any risk of scratching, though the rouge is far softer than the glass and would not scratch even with considerable force. The sound of the polishing is a faint, rhythmic whisper that is barely audible beneath the constant roar of the wind against the lantern glass, a small intimate noise that belongs to the interior world of the tower rather than the exterior world of the storm. The rag glides over the curved surface with a slight resistance that decreases as the film of salt and oil is lifted away, leaving behind the faint pink haze of the drying rouge. The lamp at the center of the lens continues to burn with its steady yellow flame, a complex argan burner with concentric wicks that draw spermaceti oil upward from the reservoir through capillary action. The flame is remarkably bright for its size and remarkably steady as well, a quality that comes from the careful design of the air passages that supply oxygen to the combustion zone. The heat from the lamp rises through the copper funnel above the lens and escapes through the ventilating cowl in the roof, a constant draft that carries away the products of combustion and prevents the glass from fogging with condensation. The warmth of the lamp is a comfort in the cold of the lantern room, and you feel it on your face as you work close to the lens, a gentle radiance that contrasts with the chill that seeps through the glass panes from the storm outside. The polishing of the central bullseye panel continues in its slow methodical progression, the rag moving from top to bottom and from left to right in overlapping arcs that ensure complete coverage. The glass beneath the rouge haze is beginning to reveal its true character, a deep crystalline clarity that seems to hold light within its thickness rather than merely transmitting it. The prisms of the Fresnel lens are made of a special formulation of glass that has minimal color distortion, and when perfectly clean, they reveal the warm amber glow of the lamp without any of the greenish or bluish tints that appear in lesser materials. The salt film that you are removing is nearly invisible to the untrained eye, but the trained eye can detect it as a slight milkiness that softens the sharp edges of the prism facets, a subtle degradation of the optical purity that is the mark of a properly maintained lighthouse. The difference between a clean lens and a slightly fouled one might be the difference between a ship seeing the light at 15 miles or seeing it only at 12, and in the treacherous waters around the Eddystone rocks, those 3 miles can be the margin between safe passage and disaster. The brass rings that hold the prisms in their precise geometric arrangement require attention as well, and you pause in the polishing of the glass to address the metal components. A separate rag is used for the brass, one that has been designated for this purpose and which carries a slightly heavier application of the rouge paste. The brass responds quickly to the polishing, taking on a warm, luminous sheen that contrasts with the darker patina of the areas that have not been reached. The motion is different for the brass, a back and forth rubbing along the length of the ring rather than the circular sweep used on the glass, and you work the rouge into the crevices around the delicate adjusting screws that allow the lens panels to be aligned with the horizon. The brass fittings are not merely decorative, they are structural elements that hold the heavy glass prisms in position against the forces of vibration and the subtle shifts that occur as the tower expands and contracts with temperature changes. A loose prism would not fall out because the design incorporates multiple retaining features, but it might shift enough to misdirect the light and create a dark sector in the beam, and so the security of every screw and clamp is checked as part of the polishing routine. The storm outside has continued to intensify during the time you have been working on the central panel, and the sound of the wind has risen from a steady roar to something that approaches a shriek in the higher gusts. The lantern glass vibrates in its iron frames with a high-frequency rattle that adds a new note to the symphony of the tower, a sharp percussive element that punctuates the deeper sustained tones of the wind around the gallery and the low grinding rumble of the sea against the reef. The tower itself trembles with a long period oscillation that you feel through the soles of your boots as a subtle rocking motion, a flexing of the entire granite column under the immense loads imposed by the hurricane-force gusts. The movement is small, no more than a fraction of an inch at the lantern level, but it is perceptible to someone who has spent enough time in the tower to know its normal stillness. The flexing is a design feature of the Smeaton Tower, a recognition that a completely rigid structure would crack under the forces that the sea can bring, and the interlocking granite blocks are fitted with dovetail joints that allow a small amount of movement while maintaining the integrity of the column. You move from the central bullseye to the smaller prisms that are arranged above and below the main belt, the catadioptric elements that catch light spilling upward and downward and redirect it into the horizontal plane. The upper prisms are reached by climbing a short wooden step ladder that stands permanently in the lantern room for this purpose, its legs fitted with leather pads to prevent scratching the deck and its treads worn smooth by countless ascents. The upper prisms are smaller than the bullseye panels, and they are arranged in a complex geometry of angles that collects the light that would otherwise escape uselessly toward the ceiling and bends it back down to join the main beam. The polishing of these smaller elements requires a different technique because the spaces between them are narrow, and the brass framework creates shadows that make it difficult to see the condition of the glass. You use the corner of the rag folded into a precise point to reach into these gaps, applying the rouge with care, and then removing the dried residue with the same attention to detail. The work is slower at the top of the lens because of the awkward position and the need to maintain balance on the ladder while reaching upward, but the slowness is not a hindrance. It is simply the pace at which careful work proceeds. The heat from the lamp rises past your face as you work on the upper prisms, and you can feel the warm draft carrying the scent of hot oil and the faint ozone smell that comes from the combustion zone. The copper funnel above the lens glows with a dull warmth where it catches the rising heat and the ventilating cowl in the roof turns slowly to face the wind, maintaining the draft that feeds the lamp. The cowl makes a soft creaking sound as it rotates, a sound that has been part of the tower's voice for as long as anyone can remember, and it provides a kind of company in the solitary hours of the night watch, a reminder that the tower is a living thing with its own rhythms and its own responses to the weather. The lower prisms will come next, after the upper section is complete, and they present their own challenges because of their position near the floor where spray and condensation tend to settle. The lower ring of prisms directs light downward at a steep angle to illuminate the reef directly below the tower, a warning for any vessel that has come too close to the rocks despite the main beam and the sound of the breaking waves. The salt film accumulates more quickly on the lower prisms than on any other part of the lens because of their proximity to the deck, where water from wet boots and spray blown through the ventilation openings creates a more humid environment. You will kneel on the wooden deck to polish these elements, and the position will grow uncomfortable after a time. But discomfort is a familiar companion on the night watch, and it is ignored in the same way that the roar of the storm is ignored, by focusing the attention on the work and letting the body manage its own complaints. The rouge paste on the central panel has dried to a faint pink haze by the time you descend from the ladder and you inspect the work using the light of the hand lantern, held at a low angle, to reveal any streaks or mist spots. The glass is clean and the pink haze is even across the entire surface, indicating that the rouge was applied uniformly and that no areas were skipped. The dried rouge will be removed in the final buffing with the chamois leather, but that step comes later, after all the glass surfaces have been polished and the rouge has had time to dry completely. Buffing too soon while the rouge is still slightly damp can smear the residue and require starting over, a lesson that every assistant keeper learns early in their time on the rock. The upper prisms are finished now, and you step down from the ladder feeling the solidity of the deck beneath your boots with a small sense of satisfaction. The lens is beginning to show the results of the night's work, the brass gleaming softly in the amber light, and the glass surfaces acquiring that particular quality of transparency that seems almost invisible, as if there is nothing between the flame and the eye except air. The storm continues to rage outside with undiminished fury, and the tower continues to tremble with each heavy impact of the larger waves. But inside the lantern room, the work proceeds at its own pace, undisturbed by the violence of the weather. You prepare a fresh rag for the lower prisms, adding a small amount of rouge paste from the saucer and folding the cloth into a shape that will fit into the narrow spaces between the angled glass elements. The lower ring is arranged in a circle around the base of the lens assembly, a series of triangular prisms set into brass frames that angle the light downward at a precise inclination. The prisms are smaller than the bullseye panels and more numerous, each one requiring individual attention, because the salt film accumulates unevenly depending on the orientation of the glass relative to the prevailing drafts in the lantern room. You kneel on the wooden deck with the rag in your hand, and you begin the slow circuit of the lower ring, working from prism to prism with the same methodical care that you applied to the upper sections. The position is awkward because the prisms are set low and you must bend forward to reach them properly, the weight of your upper body supported by one hand on the deck, while the other hand works the rag into the angles and curves of the glass. The muscles of your back and shoulders will grow tired before the lower ring is complete. But this is a familiar tiredness, and it is accepted as part of the duty. The sound of the storm is louder near the floor, where the vibration of the tower is transmitted more directly through the deck and into your knees and hands, a constant low-frequency hum that seems to come from the stone itself rather than from the air. The lower prisms reveal their accumulated film as the rouge begins to work, a faint milkiness that clears away under the circular motion of the rag, leaving the glass bright and transparent. The light from the lamp passes through these lower prisms and emerges as a fan of radiance that sweeps across the reef in time with the rotation of the lens, illuminating the chaos of white water and black rock that surrounds the base of the tower. You cannot see this illumination from inside the lantern room, because the angle of the glass directs the light downward and outward, but you've seen it from the deck of the supply boat on calmer days, and you know that it creates a ring of visibility around the tower that serves as the final warning for any vessel that has strayed too close. The polishing of the lower ring takes longer than the upper sections because of the greater number of individual prisms and the more difficult access. You work your way around the circle with patience and without hurry because there is no deadline except the dawn and the dawn is still many hours away. The storm has settled into a steady state by this point in the night, the wind velocity no longer increasing, but maintaining a sustained force that keeps the sea in a condition of continuous violent motion. The waves that break against the reef are large enough to send heavy spray against the lantern glass, despite its height above the normal water level, sudden curtains of white water that obscure the view and make the interior of the room seem darker for a moment before the light reasserts itself. The glass panes are streaked with salt on the exterior where the spray has dried and the view through them is distorted. A shifting, abstract pattern of grey and black and white that conveys nothing of the actual sea state except its general turbulence. The final prism of the lower ring is polished, and you rise slowly from the kneeling position, feeling the protest of stiffened joints and the relief of straightened limbs. The lens now has a uniform haze of dried rouge across all its glass surfaces, from the uppermost catadioptric elements to the lower warning prisms, a faint pinkish cast that will be removed in the final buffing. You set aside the polishing rag and take up the chamois leather from its tin box, feeling the soft suited texture that is ideal for this last step. The chamois is used dry without any additional compound, and the motion is lighter than before. A gentle wiping that picks up the dried rouge particles and leaves the glass gleaming with a clarity that seems almost liquid in its depth. You begin the buffing at the top of the lens, working your way downward in the same sequence that you followed for the polishing, the chamois gliding over the glass with a faint squeaking sound that indicates perfect cleanliness. The pink haze disappears under the leather, leaving behind a surface so transparent that the lamp flame seems to float unsupported in the center of the lens, its yellow radiance passing through the prisms without any visible diminishment or distortion. The brass fittings gleam softly in the amber light, and the entire assembly has the appearance of a precision instrument maintained to the highest standard, which it is. The buffing continues through the central bullseye panel and down into the lower ring, where the chamois reaches into the narrow spaces between prisms to remove the last traces of dried rouge. The work is repetitive and calming, and it occupies the final hours of the night watch, while the storm continues to rage outside, and the tower continues to tremble, and the sea continues to pound against the reef with its ancient, unending rhythm. When the last prism has been buffed and the chamois has been returned to its tin box, and the rags have been folded and placed in the basket for washing, you stand near the pedestal and watch the lens rotate in its silent circle, the beam sweeping across the darkness with a clarity that is the result of the night's careful labor. The glass is clean and the light is bright and the tower stands, and that is enough. The storm has reached a point in its development where the distinction between individual gusts and the steady wind becomes difficult to maintain, a condition in which the air itself seems to have taken on a solid weight and presence that presses against the tower from every direction at once. The lantern room exists within this pressure as a bubble of relative stillness, though the glass panes bow inward by a fraction of an inch under the force of the wind and the iron frames creak with a sound like the stretching of old leather. The polishing of the Fresnel lens is complete for this watch, and the glass surfaces gleam with the particular clarity that comes from careful attention, the chamois leather having removed the last traces of dried rouge and left behind a transparency that seems to hold the lamp flame suspended in amber liquid rather than air. The lens rotates on its mercury float with a silent precision that never fails to seem remarkable, given the violence of the conditions outside. The great bullseye panel sweeping past the fixed mark on the floor every 4 minutes, while the beam reaches out across the chaotic water with a regularity that serves as the heartbeat of the Eddystone. You have settled onto the small wooden stool near the clockwork mechanism, where you can observe both the lamp and the barometer, and the slowly turning lens, while remaining within easy reach of the winding crank should the weight descend too far before the principal keeper arrives to relieve you. The stool is simple in its construction, 3 legs joined by stretchers and a shaped seat that has been worn smooth by the passage of many watchkeepers over the years, its surface darkened by the oil and salt that transfer from wool trousers during the long hours of sitting. The position is comfortable enough for a time, though the hardness of the wood eventually makes itself known through the layers of clothing, a minor discomfort that serves to keep the mind from drifting too far towards sleep while the body remains still. The warmth of the lamp reaches you where you sit, a gentle radiance that takes the edge off the chill that seeps through the glass and the stone, and the smell of hot spermaceti oil mingles with the metallic scent of brass and the clean sharpness of the spirits of wine that lingers from the polishing. The sounds of the tower during a great storm are many and varied, and they arrange themselves into layers that can be separated by the attentive ear in the same way that a musician might separate the instruments in an orchestra. The uppermost layer is the voice of the wind itself, a sustained roar that rises and falls in long, slow cycles as the gusts sweep across the open water and strike the lantern gallery. The wind makes different sounds depending on what it encounters. A high, thin whistle where it passes through the narrow gaps between the iron frames and the glass. A deeper hooting note around the curve of the tower's stone cylinder. A rushing whisper across the flat surface of the roof lead. These sounds blend together into a continuous presence that fills the lantern room and makes ordinary conversation impossible. Though conversation is rarely necessary during the night watch, when one person alone tends the light and the other rests in the quarters below. Beneath the voice of the wind there is the sound of the sea against the reef. A sound that is not a single thing but a complex arrangement of many overlapping elements that change with each passing wave. The larger waves arrive with a deep bass rumble that can be felt in the chest as much as heard. A sound that begins far out in the darkness as the swell steepens over the shallowing bottom and gathers itself for the final rush toward the rocks. The impact of the wave against the granite base of the tower produces a heavy thud that travels up through the stone and into the lantern room, a percussive note that makes the glass panes vibrate in their frames and causes the flame of the hand lantern to flicker briefly, though the main lamp remains steady behind its protective chimney. The retreat of the water after the impact creates a prolonged hissing sound as the foam and spray drain back across the uneven surface of the reef, a sound like the exhalation of some enormous creature that lives in the deep water and breathes only during storms. The third layer of sound is the voice of the tower itself, the creaks and groans and ticks that come from the stone and the iron and the wood as the structure responds to the forces acting upon it. The Smeaton Tower was built to flex slightly under extreme loads rather than resist them rigidly, a principle of engineering that recognizes the impossibility of building a structure strong enough to withstand the full force of the Atlantic without some yielding. The interlocking granite blocks are fitted with dovetailed joints and oak wedges that allow a small amount of movement while maintaining the integrity of the column. And during a storm of this magnitude, that movement becomes perceptible as a series of subtle sounds that emanate from the walls and the floor and the ceiling. The stone itself seems to breathe with a slow rhythm that corresponds to the arrival of the largest waves, a deep creaking that travels up through the masonry and into the iron framework of the lantern room. The most distinctive of the tower's voices during a storm is the sound that the older keepers call the groan of the rock, a low-frequency vibration that comes not from the tower itself, but from the reef upon which it stands. The Eddystone rocks are not a single solid mass, but a collection of gynes formations that have been fractured and worn by countless millennia of wave action, their surfaces carved into channels and crevices and undercuts that create a complex underwater topography. When the great storm waves pass over this terrain, they set the rocks in motion in ways that are not visible from the surface, but which transmit through the stone as sound and vibration. The groan is a deep resonant tone that seems to come from everywhere at once, a sound that is felt in the bones of the inner ear more than heard by the ordinary mechanism of hearing, and it has been described by those who have experienced it as the voice of the earth itself, protesting the weight of the sea. You have heard the groan of the rock on previous occasions when the weather has been severe enough to move the larger boulders in the shallows around the tower's base, but the sound tonight is different in its depth and its persistence. The storm of 1824 has generated waves of a size that have rarely been recorded on this coast, great moving hills of water that travel unimpeded across the Atlantic from their birthplace in some distant disturbance of the atmosphere. The waves lift the entire body of the sea as they pass, and when they reach the shallow water around the reef they steepen into vertical faces of green and white that crash against the rocks with an impact that can be measured in tons per square foot. The reef responds to this assault with its own deep voice, a continuous low rumble that underlies all the other sounds of the storm and provides a foundation upon which they are built. The groan of the rock is not a single note, but a shifting chord that changes as the waves arrive from different angles and strike different portions of the reef. The main direction of the swell is from the southwest, where the Atlantic stretches unbroken toward the Americas, and the wind has had thousands of miles to build the sea into its present condition. The waves approach the Eddystone from this quarter, and they strike the western face of the reef first, a submerged ledge that rises steeply from deep water and concentrates the wave energy into a narrow zone of impact. The groan that results from this initial contact is a deep bass note that seems to come from beneath your feet and travels upward through the stool and into your body, a vibration that makes the teeth ache slightly if you clench your jaw. As the wave wraps around the reef and strikes the northern and southern faces, the groan changes its character, becoming more complex and acquiring higher harmonics that are produced by the smaller rocks grinding against each other in the shallows. The sound of the reef in motion is a reminder of the forces that shaped this place long before any human thought to build a tower upon it. The Eddystone rocks are part of a formation that extends beneath the seabed for unknown distances, a spine of ancient stone that has resisted the wearing of the sea, while the softer surrounding materials have been eroded away over millions of years. The rocks themselves are gneiss, a metamorphic stone that was formed under immense heat and pressure deep within the Earth's crust, and later exposed by the slow uplift of the land and the retreat of ancient seas. The surface of the rock is marked by the passage of time and tide, smoothed in some places to a polish by the constant friction of sand and pebbles, and carved in other places into deep fissures where the sea rushes in and out with each wave. The groan that you hear tonight is the sound of this ancient stone being worked upon by the same forces that have been working upon it since long before there were ears to hear. A slow geological conversation that continues without pause through storm and calm alike. The tower transmits these sounds with a fidelity that makes the lantern room an ideal listening post for the symphony of the storm. The granite blocks that form the walls are dense and homogeneous, and they conduct vibration with very little loss, carrying the deep tones of the reef upward through the column and into the iron framework of the lantern, where they emerge as audible sound. The glass panes act as membranes that vibrate in sympathy with certain frequencies, adding their own high, thin notes to the composition. The wooden deck of the lantern room resonates at a lower frequency, and you can feel it through the soles of your boots as a gentle trembling that never entirely ceases. The stool upon which you sit is connected to this vibrating system, and it hums with a faint buzz that can be felt through the thighs and the buttocks, a sensation that is not unpleasant, but which serves as a constant reminder of the energy that surrounds the tower. The clockwork mechanism in the service room below adds its own voice to the chorus, a steady metronomic tick that is barely audible beneath the roar of the storm, but which can be discerned by the attentive ear. The escapement releases one tooth at a time with a precision that has been calibrated to rotate the lens exactly once every 4 minutes, and each release produces a small sharp sound that travels up through the pedestal and into the floor of the lantern room. The tick is regular and predictable, and it provides a kind of anchor for the mind in the midst of the chaos outside. A reminder that the human world continues to function according to its own rhythms, regardless of what the sea and the wind may do. The weight that drives the mechanism descends slowly in its shaft, and you can hear the faint creak of the chain over the pulley each time the weight drops by a fraction of an inch, a sound that is so subtle it is more imagined than heard, but which contributes to the overall texture of the tower's voice. The ventilating cowl in the roof adds another element to the soundscape, a soft creaking as it turns to face the shifting wind. The cowl is designed to maintain the draft that feeds fresh air to the lamp and carries away the products of combustion, and it must rotate freely to follow the changes in wind direction that occur even during a steady gale. The bearing upon which it turns is a simple iron ring, lubricated with tallow, and it produces a sound like the slow opening of a heavy door, a sound that occurs at irregular intervals as the wind backs and veers through small angles. The cowl is visible from where you sit as a dark shape against the slightly lighter darkness of the roof, and you can see it moving in small jerks and pauses, a patient weather vane that has turned through countless storms and will turn through countless more. The condensation that forms on the inside of the lantern glass produces a sound of its own, the soft dripping, as the moisture accumulates and runs down the panes to collect in the copper channels that carry it away. The channels are fitted with small spouts that direct the water to the outside, where it joins the spray and the rain and returns to the sea from which it came. The The dripping is irregular, and it creates a counterpoint to the steady tick of the clockwork, a random element that humanizes the mechanical precision of the tower's interior. The drops fall into the copper pan that sits beneath the lowest point of the channels, and each drop produces a small clear note that cuts through the deeper sounds of the storm like a tiny bell. The sounds of the tower during a storm are not merely a backdrop to the work of keeping the light. They are a source of information about the conditions outside and the state of the structure itself. The experienced keeper learns to read these sounds in the same way that a sailor reads the set of the sails and the feel of the helm, extracting meaning from the subtle variations in pitch and rhythm and intensity. A change in the groan of the rock might indicate that the wave direction has shifted and that the storm is entering a new phase. An increase in the creaking of the tower's joints might suggest that the wind has strengthened further and that additional precautions should be taken. The sudden absence of a familiar sound can be as informative as its presence, and the ear that is attuned to the normal voices of the tower will notice immediately when one of those voices falls silent. The night deepens toward its darkest hour while you sit on the wooden stool and listen to the symphony of the storm. The beam of the Fresnel lens continues to sweep across the invisible sea with its steady 4-minute rhythm, a rhythm that has become so familiar that you no longer consciously notice its passage, though some part of your mind continues to track it and would alert you immediately if the interval were to change. The lamp burns with its steady yellow flame, and the oil level in the reservoir descends by slow increments that you check at regular intervals by the light of the hand lantern. The barometer on the wall of the service room has stopped falling and now holds steady at a very low reading, a sign that the storm has reached its maximum intensity and will likely maintain this condition for some hours before beginning its slow decline. The groan of the rock is a sound that invites contemplation because it operates at a frequency that seems to bypass the ordinary mechanisms of thought and speak directly to something older and deeper in the human consciousness. It is the sound of the earth in motion, a reminder that the solid ground upon which all human confidence is built is itself subject to forces that dwarf any human endeavor. The tower that shelters you tonight is a remarkable achievement of engineering and craftsmanship, a structure that has withstood the assaults of the sea for decades and will likely continue to do so for decades more. But it is also a small thing compared to the reef upon which it stands, and the reef itself is a small thing compared to the sea that surrounds it. The groan of the rock puts these proportions into perspective without any need for conscious reflection, a direct sensory experience of scale that quiets the mind and reduces the self to its proper dimensions. The other sounds of the tower provide a counterbalance to this immensity. The small human sounds of the clockwork and the dripping condensation and the creak of the ventilating cowl. These are the sounds of order and maintenance and the quiet persistence of human purpose in the face of the indifferent sea. The lens rotates because men designed it to rotate and built the mechanism that drives it and wound the weight that powers it. The lamp burns because men harvested the oil and refined it and transported it to this remote rock and trimmed the wick and filled the reservoir. The tower stands because men quarried the granite and shaped the blocks and fitted them together with dovetailed joints and oak wedges and placed them upon the reef with a precision that has allowed the structure to flex without breaking. The small sounds of the interior are the sounds of that human purpose, continuing through the night and through the storm without pause or complaint. You rise from the stool after a time to check the lamp and to ensure that the oil level is adequate for the remaining hours of darkness. The argon burner glows with a steady yellow flame that fills the interior of the lens with a warm radiance, and you can see the concentric wicks burning evenly without any smoky edges or dark spots. The wick will need trimming at the next watch change, but for now it is performing its function perfectly, and the light that passes through the clean prisms is as bright and clear as it can possibly be. The heat from the lamp rises past your face as you lean close to inspect the flame, and you can feel the draft that carries the combustion products upward through the copper funnel, a gentle flow of warm air that smells of hot oil and the faint ozone scent of the flame. The lamp requires nothing from you at this moment, and you return to the stool and resume your listening. The storm shows no sign of diminishing as the hours pass, and the groan of the rock continues its deep bass rumble beneath the other sounds of the tower. The waves that break against the reef are large enough now that the spray from their impact reaches the lantern glass with increasing frequency. Sudden curtains of white water that obscure the view and make the interior of the room seem darker for a moment before the light reasserts itself. The glass panes are streaked with salt on the exterior, and the view through them is a shifting abstraction of grey and black and white that conveys nothing of the actual sea state except its general turbulence. The world outside the lantern room has become a single, undifferentiated medium of wind and water and darkness, and the only fixed points in this medium are the beam of the Eddystone light and the tower from which it shines. The principal keeper will climb the stairs in a few hours to relieve you, and the routine will continue as it has through every storm that has tested this tower since it was first built. The sounds of the storm will persist through the daylight hours and into the next night, and perhaps the night after that, before the wind finally tires and the sea begins to settle. The groan of the rock will fade as the waves diminish, and the reef will return to its usual near silence, broken only by the regular surge of the swell and the cries of the seabirds that will return when the weather moderates. But for now, in the deepest hours of the night, with the storm at its full intensity, the tower sings its many-voiced song, and you sit on the wooden stool and listen and wait for the first grey light of dawn to appear above the eastern horizon. The mechanism that turns the great Fresnel lens is housed in the service room directly below the lantern, a circular chamber of dressed granite, where the clockwork resides in a tall iron frame bolted to the floor and to the wall. The room is smaller than the lantern above and the living quarters below, a middle space that exists primarily to contain the machinery of rotation and to provide access to the weight shaft that descends through the center of the tower. The air in the service room is warmer than the lantern because of the heat that rises from the stove in the kitchen below, but it is cooler than the living quarters because of the constant draft that moves upward through the tower, seeking the ventilating cowl in the roof. This managed to survive some efficient insulation fire and fine machine oil and the faint ozone scent that comes from the friction of moving parts, a clean mechanical odor that speaks of precision and maintenance, and the quiet persistence of human ingenuity. The clockwork mechanism is a masterpiece of 19th century engineering, a system of gears and escapements and weights that converts the slow descent of a heavy stone into the precise rotation of the lens carriage 50 feet above the reef. The main frame is constructed of cast iron painted black to resist the salt air, and it stands as tall as a man with its various shafts and bearings arranged in a vertical plane that makes efficient use of the limited floor space. The gears are brass, and they mesh with a silence that comes from careful machining and regular lubrication, their teeth engaging and disengaging in a continuous flow of motion that has no beginning and no end. The largest gear is nearly 3 feet in diameter, and it turns slowly on a polished steel shaft, while the smaller gears multiply its rotation to the speed required by the lens, a ratio that has been calculated to produce exactly 1 revolution every 4 minutes at the lantern level. The power for this motion comes from a weight that hangs in a vertical shaft cut through the center of the tower, a shaft that extends from the service room down through the living quarters and into the storeroom at the base. The weight is a large block of dressed granite, similar to the blocks that form the tower's walls, but shaped into a rectangular form with an iron eye set into its top, where the lifting chain is attached. The chain passes over a pulley at the top of the shaft and then down to a drum on the clockwork frame, where it is wound in neat coils when the mechanism is cranked. The weight descends by gravity alone, and its descent is regulated by the escapement, which releases 1 tooth of the gear train at a time, with a precise interval that has been calibrated to the desired rotation speed. The descent is slow and steady, and it takes several hours for the weight to travel from the top of the shaft to the bottom, at which point the keeper must wind the mechanism again by turning the large crank that raises the weight back to its starting position. The winding crank is a heavy iron handle that fits onto a square shaft projecting from the side of the clockwork frame, and it requires a certain amount of physical effort to turn because of the mechanical advantage that has been designed into the gear train. The act of winding is a rhythmic task that occupies the hands and the back and the shoulders, while the mind remains free to wander, a task that is performed at regular intervals throughout the day and night according to the schedule of the watches. The sound of the crank is a series of clicks as the pawl engages with the ratchet wheel, each click corresponding to a small increment of lift applied to the weight, and the sound echoes in the stone chamber with a clarity that cuts through the constant roar of the storm outside. The winding takes several minutes to complete, and when it is finished, the weight hangs once more at the top of the shaft, and the clockwork resumes its steady ticking, and the lens continues its silent rotation above. The connection between the clockwork in the service room and the lens in the lantern room is made by a vertical shaft that passes up through the ceiling and into the base of the pedestal upon which the lens assembly rests. The shaft is a length of polished iron that turns in bearings lubricated with spermaceti oil, the same oil that feeds the lamp, and it transmits the rotation of the clockwork to the lens carriage with a direct mechanical linkage that requires no further gears or adjustments. The shaft emerges from the floor of the lantern room at the center of the circular deck, and it rises into the pedestal, where it engages with the rotating platform that supports the entire weight of the lens assembly. The platform is a heavy casting of brass and iron that must be strong enough to bear the weight of the prisms and the frames and the lamp, while remaining perfectly level and true, so that the beam sweeps the horizon without dipping or rising. The most remarkable feature of this rotating platform is not its strength or its precision, but the manner in which it is supported, a detail of engineering that transforms the entire character of the mechanism from a conventional bearing system into something that seems almost magical in its silent efficiency. The lens carriage does not roll on balls or rollers or plain bearings of the sort that might be expected in a heavy rotating assembly. Instead, it floats on a bath of mercury contained in a circular trough that forms the base of the pedestal, a shallow channel of cast iron lined with a material that resists the amalgamating properties of the liquid metal. The mercury provides a nearly frictionless bearing surface that allows tons of brass and glass to rotate with the pressure of a single finger, a fact that can be demonstrated by placing a hand against the carriage and feeling the ease with which it moves when the clockwork is disengaged for maintenance. The mercury trough is visible through a small inspection port in the side of the pedestal, a rectangular opening fitted with a brass cover that can be slid aside to reveal the silvery pool within. The mercury itself is a substance that seems to belong more to the realm of alchemy than to ordinary mechanics, a liquid metal that flows like water but weighs more than lead and reflects light with a peculiar bluish gleam that is unlike any other surface. The trough is filled to a depth of perhaps 1.5 inches, and the rotating platform sits within this depth, supported not by any solid contact but by the displacement of the heavy liquid, a principle similar to that of a ship floating in water, but with the advantage that mercury is incompressible and provides a support that is absolutely rigid in the vertical direction, while offering almost no resistance to horizontal rotation. The properties of mercury that make it suitable for this application are several, and they combine to create a bearing system that has no equal in the mechanical arts of the early 19th century. The liquid is dense beyond ordinary experience, and a relatively small volume provides sufficient buoyant force to support a great weight, a force that is distributed evenly across the entire bottom surface of the rotating platform without any concentration of stress at particular points. The liquid conforms perfectly to the shape of the platform and the trough, eliminating any need for the precise machining that would be required if solid bearings were used, a consideration of great practical importance in an age when large-scale precision machining was still in its early development. The liquid provides damping as well as support, and any vibration that might be transmitted from the tower to the lens is absorbed by the mercury rather than being passed through to the delicate glass prisms. The mercury float has another advantage that is less immediately obvious but which contributes greatly to the reliability of the Eddystone light. Because there is no solid contact between the rotating platform and the stationary trough, there is no wear and no need for lubrication other than the mercury itself, which does not degrade or evaporate or require replacement under normal conditions. The bearings of a conventional rotating assembly would gradually wear under the constant motion and the salt-laden atmosphere of the lantern room, requiring periodic replacement and introducing the possibility of failure at a critical moment. The mercury float eliminates this source of wear entirely, and the only maintenance required is an occasional inspection to ensure that the level of the liquid remains sufficient and that no foreign matter has found its way into the trough where it might interfere with the smooth rotation. The level of the mercury is checked as part of the regular routine of the assistant keeper during the night watch, and you perform this check several times over the course of the hours between midnight and dawn. The inspection port is opened and the light of the hand lantern is directed into the interior of the pedestal, revealing the circular trough and the silvery pool that fills it. The surface of the Mercury is perfectly still despite the vibration of the tower and the roar of the storm outside, a small sea of liquid metal that remains undisturbed by the forces that are shaking the granite walls. The rotating platform sits within this pool, and its lower edge is submerged by a precise amount that has been determined by the weight of the lens assembly and the density of the mercury, a calculation that was made when the system was first installed and which has required no adjustment since. The stillness of the mercury surface is a phenomenon that invites contemplation because it seems to contradict the evidence of the senses that report the constant trembling of the tower. The granite blocks are vibrating with a low frequency that can be felt through the soles of the boots, and the wooden deck creaks with each heavy impact of the larger waves, yet the mercury in its trough shows no sign of this disturbance. The explanation lies in the density of the liquid and the nature of the forces involved, for the vibrations that travel through the stone are of a frequency and amplitude that cannot overcome the inertia of the heavy mercury. The liquid simply remains where it is while the trough moves around it, a small demonstration of the principle that mass resists acceleration, and the result is a bearing surface that is effectively isolated from the mechanical noise of the tower's response to the storm. The appearance of the mercury in the light of the hand lantern is memorable and strange, a surface that reflects with a brilliance that is both metallic and liquid at the same time. The color is silver, with a faint bluish cast that becomes more pronounced near the edges where the light strikes at a glancing angle. The surface is perfectly smooth, and it shows no ripples or waves or any of the small disturbances that characterize the surface of water or oil. The mercury seems to exist in a state of absolute rest that is independent of the conditions around it, a small pocket of stillness at the heart of the rotating mechanism that makes the motion of the lens possible. The contrast between this stillness and the violence of the storm outside is a thing that the mind returns to during the long hours of the watch, a reminder that calm can exist within chaos, and that the most effective response to disturbance is often a quiet immovability. The rotation of the lens on its mercury float is so smooth that it is almost impossible to detect by sight alone, unless one watches the fixed mark on the floor and observes the slow passage of the brass carriage past that reference point. The motion is continuous and unvarying, and it produces no sound beyond the faint tick of the escapement in the service room below, a tick that is transmitted up through the iron pedestal and into the floor of the lantern room, where it can be heard as a soft regular pulse beneath the roar of the wind. The lens carriage glides through its circle with a silence that seems almost supernatural, given the weight of the assembly and the conditions under which it operates, a silence that is the direct result of the mercury float and the absence of any solid bearing surfaces that might produce friction and noise. The mercury trough requires no attention from you during this watch beyond the routine inspection that confirms the level is correct, and the liquid is free of contamination. The trough is covered for most of its circumference by the rotating platform, and only the small section visible through the inspection port can be seen. But this is sufficient to assess the condition of the system. The mercury has a tendency to accumulate a thin film of oxidation on its surface over time, a faint greyish skin that forms when the liquid is exposed to the air, but this film does not affect the performance of the bearing, and it is simply stirred back into the body of the liquid by the motion of the platform. The mercury does not evaporate to any significant degree, and the level remains constant from month to month and year to year, a testament to the stability of the element and the care with which the system was designed. The weight of the lens assembly that floats upon this mercury bath is considerable, and it is worth pausing to consider the magnitude of the forces involved. The brass rings and frames that hold the prisms are heavy castings that have been machined to precise dimensions and fitted together with close tolerances. The glass prisms themselves are thick and dense, and they add their own substantial weight to the total. The argand lamp at the center with its reservoir of oil and its copper chimney and its complex arrangement of wicks and air passages contributes further to the load. The entire assembly weighs several tons, and yet it rotates with a force that can be overcome by the pressure of a single finger placed against the carriage, a fact that demonstrates the effectiveness of the mercury float as a bearing system. The clockwork in the service room is not required to overcome the friction of the bearing, because there is effectively no friction to overcome. The mechanism is required only to overcome the inertia of the rotating mass, and to maintain the precise speed of rotation against the small resistance of the air and the slight drag of the mercury's viscosity. The weight that drives the system provides a constant force that is regulated by the escapement, and the result is a rotation that is as steady and reliable as the turning of the Earth itself. The 4-minute period of the Eddystone light is one of the identifying characteristics that allows mariners to recognize the tower and distinguish it from other lights along the coast, and the maintenance of this precise interval is one of the primary responsibilities of the keepers. The inspection of the mercury is complete, and you close the brass cover over the port, returning the pedestal to its usual appearance of solid, impenetrable iron. The lens continues its silent rotation, and the beam sweeps across the invisible sea with its steady 4-minute rhythm, a rhythm that has not faltered since the tower was first lit, and will not falter so long as the keepers wind the clockwork and tend the lamp and polish the glass. The storm outside has not diminished, and the groan of the rock continues its deep bass rumble beneath the other sounds of the tower. But inside the lantern room there is the quiet miracle of the mercury float and the lens that turns upon it, a small victory of human ingenuity over the forces that would otherwise make such a light impossible. The pedestal that contains the mercury trough is also the structure that supports the clockwork shaft and the rotating platform, and it serves as the foundation for the entire optical system of the lighthouse. The pedestal is bolted to the floor of the lantern room with heavy iron fasteners that pass through the wooden deck and into the granite blocks beneath, a connection that ensures the alignment of the lens with the horizon will not shift even under the extreme loads imposed by the storm. The vertical shaft rises through the center of the pedestal and engages with the rotating platform through a coupling that allows a small amount of vertical movement to accommodate the expansion and contraction of the tower, with temperature changes, a refinement that prevents the mechanism from binding when the granite warms in summer or cools in winter. The mercury float is not the only innovation represented by the Eddystone lens system, but it is perhaps the most elegant, a solution to the problem of supporting a heavy rotating assembly that is both simple and sophisticated at the same time. The principle was known to the ancients, and there are records of mercury being used for ceremonial purposes in temples and tombs. But its application to lighthouse engineering was a development of the early 19th century that transformed the possibilities of coastal illumination. The Fresnel lens itself was a revolutionary advance in optics that allowed a single lamp to project a beam of unprecedented brightness and range, but the lens would have been of limited use without a reliable means of rotation that could maintain the characteristic flash pattern that identified the light to passing ships. The mercury float provided that means with a silence and a reliability that no other bearing system could match. The hours of the night watch continue to pass, and you remain near the pedestal where you can observe the rotation of the lens and listen to the steady tick of the escapement below. The mercury in its trough continues to support the weight of the assembly, and the platform continues to glide through its circle with the silent ease that never fails to seem remarkable. The storm outside continues to rage with undiminished fury, and the tower continues to tremble, and the sea continues to pound against the reef. But the lens turns, and the light shines, and the keepers maintain their watch. The mercury float does its work without complaint or attention, and it will continue to do so through this storm and through all the storms that will come in the years ahead. A quiet presence at the heart of the Eddystone light. The upper prisms of the Fresnel lens are arranged in a series of concentric rings that rise above the central bullseye belt like the crown of a mechanical flower. Each ring composed of individual glass elements set into brass frames that angle the light downward to join the main beam. These prisms are smaller than the great curved panels of the central section, and they are shaped differently as well, triangular in cross-section rather than smoothly curved. Their facets cut at precise angles that have been calculated to capture light spilling upward from the lamp and redirect it toward the horizon. The spaces between these upper prisms are narrow, and the brass framework that holds them creates a complex geometry of shadows and reflections that makes the work of polishing more demanding than the sweeping strokes used on the larger surfaces below. You've climbed the short wooden stepladder that stands permanently in the lantern room for this purpose, its 3 steps worn smooth by the passage of many boots, and its top platform providing a stable position from which to reach the uppermost elements of the lens assembly. The ladder is fitted with leather pads on its feet to prevent scratching the wooden deck, and its handrail is a simple iron bar that curves upward from the side, providing a secure grip while the other hand works with the polishing rag. The height is modest and the position is secure, but the need to reach upward and outward to access the prisms on the far side of the lens creates a gentle stretch through the shoulders and the back, a physical awareness that accompanies the slow, methodical work of this portion of the watch. The rouge paste has been prepared in the ceramic saucer, and the cotton rack has been folded into a precise shape that will fit into the narrow gaps between the prism elements. The technique for polishing the upper prisms differs from that used on the central bullseye because the surfaces are smaller and more numerous, and the access is restricted by the brass rings that divide one tier from the next. The motion is a combination of circular sweeps on the flat faces of the glass and careful linear strokes along the edges where the prisms meet the brass frames, a sequence that must be repeated for each individual element in the upper rings. The work is slow and it requires patience, but patience is the one resource that is never in short supply during the night watch on the Eddystone rocks. The first tier above the central belt consists of a ring of 12 prisms arranged like the numbers on a clock face, though without the numerals that would mark the hours. Each prism is approximately 6 inches in height and 4 inches in width, at its base tapering to a narrower dimension, at its upper edge where it meets the brass ring that separates this tier from the next. The glass is thick and heavy, and it is being ground and polished to a precision that would be remarkable in any context, but which seems almost miraculous given the conditions under which the lens must operate. The prisms catch the light from the lamp and hold it for a fraction of a moment before releasing it in a new direction, a brief detention that is invisible to the eye, but which could be calculated by the mathematics of optics. The salt film on these upper prisms is thinner than the accumulation on the lower sections because the warm air rising from the lamp carries the majority of the oil vapor upward and away through the ventilating cowl, but the film is present nonetheless, and it must be removed with the same care that is applied to every other glass surface in the lantern room. The rouge paste is applied in small amounts and worked into the glass with circular motions that cover the entire face of each prism from edge to edge. The pressure must be light, because the glass is supported only by the brass frame, and excessive force could shift the alignment of the prism, though the retaining screws are tight and the risk is small. The sound of the polishing is a soft whisper that is barely audible beneath the constant roar of the storm, a small intimate noise that belongs to the interior world of the tower. The brass rings that separate the tiers of prisms require attention as well, and you pause in the polishing of the glass to address these metal components. A separate rag is used for the brass, one that carries a slightly heavier application of the rouge paste and which is worked along the length of each ring with a back and forth motion that follows the curve of the metal. The brass responds quickly to the polishing, taking on a warm golden sheen that contrasts with the darker patina of the areas that have not yet been reached. The rings are secured by small screws that pass through tabs on the inner surface, and these screws are checked for tightness as part of the routine, a precaution against the subtle loosening that can occur from the constant vibration of the tower during a great storm. The second tier of upper prisms is smaller than the first, and it is set at a slightly different angle, its elements arranged to catch light that has passed through the lower rings and redirect it once more toward the horizontal plane. The geometry of the Fresnel lens is a cascade of such redirections, each tier of prisms performing a specific function in the overall task of gathering the divergent rays from the lamp and forming them into a parallel beam. The prisms in this second tier are more difficult to reach because they are higher and because the ladder cannot be positioned directly beneath them without interfering with the rotation of the lens carriage. You must lean outward from the ladder with one hand gripping the iron rail while the other extends to reach the glass surfaces, a position that requires balance and a certain trust in the stability of the structure. The storm outside has continued its assault on the tower during the time you have been working on the upper prisms, and the sound of the wind has acquired a new note, a high thin whistle that occurs when the gusts strike the lantern gallery at a particular angle. The glass panes vibrate in their frames, and the iron framework creaks with a sound like the stretching of old leather, a sound that has become so familiar over the course of the night that it no longer registers as separate from the general background of the storm. The tower trembles with a long, slow oscillation that you feel through the ladder as a subtle swaying motion, a flexing of the entire granite column under the immense loads imposed by the hurricane-force gusts. The movement is small, and it does not affect the stability of the ladder, but it serves as a reminder that the structure which shelters you is itself subject to the forces that are raging outside. The third and final tier of upper prisms crowns the lens assembly, and its elements are the smallest of all, delicate triangles of glass that catch the last remnants of upward spilling light and bend them back down to join the main beam. These prisms are set into a brass ring that forms the uppermost edge of the lens, and they are more exposed to the accumulation of dust and salt than the lower elements, because of their position near the top of the assembly, where the air currents from the lamp and the ventilation system create a slight turbulence. The polishing of these final prisms requires the most care because the glass is thin and the brass frames are delicate, and the position at the top of the ladder is the least stable of all. You work slowly and methodically, giving each small triangle of glass the same attention that you gave to the great bullseye panels below, a democracy of maintenance that recognizes no distinction between large and small elements in the optical system. The upper prisms are finished now, and you descend from the ladder feeling the solidity of the deck beneath your boots with a small sense of completion. The lens above the central belt gleams with the faint pink haze of drying rouge, and the brass rings shine softly in the amber light of the lamp. The work has taken the better part of an hour, and your arms and shoulders carry the pleasant tiredness that comes from sustained careful effort, a tiredness that will fade during the remaining hours of the watch while you attend to the lower sections of the lens. The lower prisms are arranged in a series of rings below the central bullseye belt, mirroring the arrangement of the upper tiers, but with a different optical function. These prisms are angled downward rather than upward, and they catch light that would otherwise fall uselessly onto the lantern floor and direct it outward at a steep angle to illuminate the reef directly below the tower. The light from these lower prisms creates a ring of visibility around the base of the Eddystone, a final warning for any vessel that has come too close to the rocks, despite the main beam and the sound of the breaking waves. The lower prisms are larger than the upper elements, and they are set into heavier brass frames that are designed to withstand the greater exposure to spray and condensation that occurs near the floor of the lantern room. You kneel on the wooden deck to begin the work on the lower prisms, a position that is familiar from countless previous watches and which brings its own particular set of sensations. The deck is hard beneath your knees despite the cushion of your wool trousers, and the wood carries the vibration of the tower more directly than the air, a constant low-frequency hum that travels up through your legs and into your body. The position requires you to bend forward to reach the prisms, and this creates a gentle stretch through the lower back that will become noticeable as the work progresses. The sounds of the storm are louder near the floor, where the vibration of the glass panes and the creaking of the iron frames are transmitted more directly through the deck, a symphony of small noises that accompanies the slow circular motion of the polishing rag. The first ring of lower prisms is set immediately below the central bullseye belt, and its elements are angled outward at approximately 45 degrees from the vertical. The salt film on these prisms is more pronounced than on the upper sections because of their position, where the warm moist air rising from the lamp meets the cooler air near the floor and deposits its burden of salt and oil vapor. The film has a slightly different character as well, a faint whitish haze rather than the clear milkiness of the upper prisms, a difference that reflects the varying conditions in different parts of the lantern room. The rouge paste cuts through this film with the same efficiency that it demonstrates on every other glass surface, and the prisms begin to reveal their true transparency as the circular motions of the rag do their work. The brass frames of the lower prisms are more substantial than those above, and they have accumulated a patina that is darker and more uneven because of their exposure to the damp that settles near the floor. The polishing of these frames requires a firmer pressure and a more generous application of the rouge paste. The rag worked into the corners and crevices where the brass meets the glass and where the retaining screws are set. The screws themselves are larger than those in the upper sections, and they are made of a bronze alloy that resists the corrosion that would quickly seize ordinary iron fasteners in the salt-laden atmosphere. Each screw is checked for tightness as part of the routine, a precaution that takes only a moment, but which contributes to the overall reliability of the lens system. The second ring of lower prisms is set at a steeper angle, and its elements are shaped to direct light even further downward toward the rocks that lie directly beneath the tower. These prisms are the most exposed to the accumulation of condensation because they are positioned where the water that drips from the lantern glass and runs down the interior of the tower walls tends to collect before being channeled away by the copper drains. The salt film on these prisms is often thicker than on any other part of the lens, and it requires a correspondingly longer application of the rouge paste to remove. The work is slow and repetitive, and it occupies the hands while the mind drifts in the way that is characteristic of the night watch, a state of relaxed attention that is neither sleep nor full wakefulness, but something between the two. The storm outside shows no sign of diminishing as you work your way around the circle of the lower prisms, and the groan of the rock continues its deep bass rumble beneath the other sounds of the tower. The waves that break against the reef are large enough now that the spray from their impact reaches the lantern glass with every major surge, and the view through the salt-streaked panes is a shifting abstraction of grey and black and white. The world beyond the glass has become a single, undifferentiated medium of wind and water and darkness, and the only fixed points in this medium are the beam of the Eddystone light and the tower from which it shines. The third ring of lower prisms is the final tier before the brass base plate that supports the entire lens assembly, and its elements are the smallest of the lower sections, though still larger than the uppermost prisms of the crown. These prisms are angled almost horizontally, and they direct light outward at a very steep angle to illuminate the reef immediately adjacent to the tower's base. The salt film on these prisms is often mixed with a fine dust that accumulates from the wear of the wooden deck and the wool clothing of the keepers, a combination that requires a slightly different technique to remove. The rouge paste is applied with a small circular motion that is more vigorous than that used on the upper prisms, and the rag is turned frequently to present a clean surface to the glass. The final prism of the lower ring is polished, and you rise slowly from the kneeling position, feeling the protest of stiffened knees and the relief of straightened legs. The lens now has a uniform haze of dried rouge across all its glass surfaces, from the uppermost crown to the lowest warning prism, a faint pinkish cast that will be removed in the final buffing with the chamois leather. The work of polishing the interim prisms is complete, and the time has come for the last stage of the night's maintenance, the gentle wiping that will reveal the full clarity of the glass and prepare the lens for the remaining hours of darkness. The interim of the prisms is a phrase that the older keepers used to describe the time spent on the smaller elements of the lens, those components that are neither the great central bullseye panels nor the lamp itself, but which occupy the spaces between and perform their quiet essential functions. The phrase carries a certain weight because it acknowledges that the work of the lighthouse is not only the dramatic moments of storm and rescue, but also the countless hours of routine maintenance that keep the light burning and the beam clear. The upper and lower prisms do their work without recognition, and they require attention without fanfare, and the keeper who tends them does so with the understanding that every part of the system contributes to the whole. You prepare for the final buffing by taking up the chamois leather from its tin box and feeling once again the soft suited texture that is ideal for removing the dried rouge without leaving any marks or scratches. The chamois is used dry and the motion is lighter than that of the polishing rack, a gentle wiping that picks up the pink haze and leaves the glass gleaming with a transparency that seems almost liquid in its depth. The buffing will proceed from the top of the lens downward, following the same sequence that was used for the polishing, and the work will occupy the final portion of the night watch, while the storm continues to rage outside, and the tower continues to tremble, and the sea continues to pound against the reef with its ancient unending rhythm. The light that passes through the polished prisms of the Fresnel lens and reaches out across the stormy water to guide the ships that navigate these dangerous waters originates in a flame that burns at the very center of the great assembly, a flame that is itself the product of careful attention and precise adjustment and the quiet accumulated knowledge of many keepers over many years. The argand lamp that produces this flame is a mechanism of remarkable sophistication, concealed within a form that appears at first glance to be little more than a brass container for oil and wick, but which reveals upon closer examination the layers of ingenuity that have been applied to the problem of producing a steady, bright light in the most demanding of conditions. The lamp sits within the central cavity of the lens assembly, supported by a brass bracket that holds it precisely at the focal point of the optical system, a position that has been determined by calculation and confirmed by observation, and which must not shift by even a fraction of an inch if the beam is to maintain its proper character. The body of the lamp is a reservoir of spun brass that holds approximately 2 gallons of spermaceti oil, enough to sustain the flame through a full night of burning at the normal rate of consumption. The reservoir is shaped like a flattened sphere, with a neck at the top where the burner assembly is mounted, and a filling port at the side that is sealed with a threaded cap and a leather washer to prevent leakage. The brass has been polished to a soft gleam that reflects the amber light of the flame, and the surface is warm to the touch, though not uncomfortably so, because the oil within acts as a heat sink, absorbing the warmth of combustion and distributing it through the mass of the liquid. The reservoir is fitted with a simple float gauge that indicates the level of the remaining oil, a small cork float attached to a thin brass rod that projects through a guide tube in the filling cap and rises or falls with the changing volume of the liquid. The burner assembly that sits atop the reservoir is the heart of the argon system, and it represents a significant advance over the simple wick lamps that had illuminated lighthouses in earlier times. The assembly consists of two concentric brass tubes that form an annular space between them, a space into which the wick is fitted in the form of a hollow cylinder rather than a flat ribbon or a solid cord. The wick itself is woven from fine cotton fibers that have been selected for their uniformity and their ability to draw oil upward through capillary action, a property that is essential to the operation of the lamp. The wick is shaped into a tube that fits precisely between the inner and outer brass cylinders, and it is held in place by a toothed ring that can be raised or lowered by means of a small rack and pinion mechanism operated by a brass key that projects from the side of the burner. The genius of the argon design lies in the manner in which it supplies air to the flame. Ordinary wick lamps draw air only from the outside of the flame, and the interior of the flame is starved of oxygen, producing a yellow smoky combustion that wastes oil and deposits soot on any nearby surface. The argon burner solves this problem by allowing air to flow upward through the center of the tubular wick as well as around the outside, so that the flame receives oxygen from both directions and burns with a completeness that produces a brighter light and a cleaner exhaust. The airflow is regulated by a glass chimney that surrounds the flame and creates a draft that draws fresh air upward through the burner while carrying the products of combustion away through the top of the chimney and into the copper funnel that leads to the ventilating cowl in the roof. The chimney is a simple cylinder of clear glass that fits into a brass collar at the base of the burner and rises to a height of perhaps 10 inches above the flame. The glass has been selected for its ability to withstand the heat of the flame without cracking, and its surface is kept clean as part of the regular maintenance routine, because any accumulation of soot or salt would reduce the transmission of light and defeat the purpose of the lamp. The chimney is slightly wider at the base than at the top, a shape that encourages the smooth flow of air and prevents the flame from flickering in response to drafts. The top of the chimney is fitted with a perforated brass cap that prevents the flame from being extinguished by sudden gusts of wind, while still allowing the exhaust gases to escape. The trimming of the wick is a task that falls to the keeper during each watch, because the cotton fibers that carry the oil to the flame are gradually consumed by the heat and must be maintained at the proper length to ensure a clean, bright burn. A wick that is too long will produce a flame that is yellow and smoky, depositing soot on the glass chimney and on the prisms of the lens, and wasting oil that could be converted into light. A wick that is too short will produce a flame that is small and weak, reducing the range of the beam and failing to provide the guidance that the ships at sea require. The proper length is a matter of experience and judgment, and it is determined by observing the character of the flame and making small adjustments with the brass key until the desired condition is achieved. You attend to the trimming of the wick during the middle hours of the night watch, when the lamp has been burning for several hours, and the cotton has begun to show the first signs of carbonization at its upper edge. The process begins with the removal of the glass chimney, which is lifted carefully from its brass collar and set aside on a padded wooden block that has been placed on the floor for this purpose. The chimney is warm to the touch, but not so hot that it cannot be handled with bare hands, and the glass has acquired a faint haze from the hours of exposure to the flame, a haze that will be wiped away before the chimney is replaced. The flame without its chimney continues to burn, but it flickers now in the drafts of the lantern room, and its color shifts from the steady white gold of confined combustion to a softer, more wavering yellow. The brass key that operates the wick adjustment mechanism is turned slowly in the direction that raises the wick by a small amount, exposing a fresh section of cotton above the top edge of the burner tubes. The charred portion of the wick that has been exposed to the flame for the past several hours is now visible as a dark, crusty ring at the very top of the cotton cylinder, and this crust must be removed to restore the clean edge that produces the best flame. You take up a small pair of brass scissors that are kept in a leather sheath attached to the side of the lamp bracket, and you trim the charred material away with a series of careful cuts that follow the circumference of the wick. The charred cotton falls away in small black fragments that are caught in a tin tray placed beneath the burner for this purpose, and the fresh cotton beneath is revealed as a clean white ring that is ready to draw oil and sustain the flame. The trimming complete the wick is lowered slightly by reversing the direction of the brass key so that only the proper amount of cotton projects above the burner tubes. The exact amount is a matter of experience, and it varies slightly depending on the quality of the oil and the temperature of the lamp and the humidity of the air. But the general principle is that the wick should project just enough to produce a flame that fills the interior of the lens without licking upward into the copper funnel where it would deposit soot and waste heat. The chimney is replaced carefully, lowering it onto the brass collar and seating it with a gentle pressure that ensures a stable connection without stressing the glass. The flame responds immediately to the restoration of the draught, steadying into a bright white gold tongue that burns without smoke or flicker and fills the interior of the Fresnel lens with its amber radiance. The care of the lamp extends beyond the trimming of the wick to include the maintenance of the oil supply and the cleaning of the various components that are exposed to the products of combustion. The reservoir must be refilled at regular intervals, and this task is performed during the day watch by the principal keeper, who brings up fresh oil from the storeroom in a brass can that holds exactly 1 gallon. The filling port is opened by unscrewing the threaded cap, and the oil is poured slowly through a fine brass strainer that catches any particles of dust or debris that might otherwise find their way into the reservoir and clog the delicate passages of the burner. The oil itself is spermaceti, a waxy substance that is harvested from the head cavities of sperm whales and which possesses the remarkable property of burning with a bright clear flame that is nearly smokeless and odorless compared to the vegetable oils and animal fats that were used in earlier times. The spermaceti oil is expensive, and it is transported to the Eddystone with great care because the loss of a single barrel would represent a significant cost and a disruption to the operation of the light. The level of the oil in the reservoir is checked at regular intervals throughout the night watch by observing the position of the float gauge that projects from the filling cap. The gauge is a simple device consisting of a thin brass rod marked with lines that indicate the quantity of oil remaining, and it rises or falls with the float that rests upon the surface of the liquid within the reservoir. The reading is taken by the light of the hand lantern, and it tells you how many hours of burning remain before the reservoir must be refilled. A calculation that is made without conscious thought because the consumption rate is known and the time until dawn is known, and the two numbers combine to produce a simple answer. The oil will last through this watch and into the next, and there is no cause for concern, but the checking is performed nonetheless because the routine is the foundation upon which the reliability of the light is built. The circular nature of maintenance aboard a rock lighthouse is nowhere more evident than in the care of the lamp, because every action that is taken to sustain the flame creates the need for further actions that must be taken in their turn. The trimming of the wick removes the charred cotton, but the trimming itself deposits small black fragments that must be cleaned from the burner assembly before they can interfere with the flow of oil or the passage of air. The burning of the oil consumes the fuel, but it also produces a faint residue that accumulates on the glass chimney and on the brass surfaces of the lamp, and this residue must be wiped away during each watch to prevent it from building into a layer that would reduce the brightness of the light. The flame heats the brass components, and this heating causes a slight expansion that can loosen the threaded connections over time, and so the connections must be checked and tightened as part of the regular inspection. The cycle of use and maintenance and use again is endless, and it will continue for as long as the tower stands and the light shines. The glass chimney requires cleaning more frequently than any other component of the lamp because it is directly exposed to the flame, and because any film that forms on its surface reduces the amount of light that reaches the prisms of the Fresnel lens. The chimney is removed from the burner during the wick trimming, and while it is off, it is wiped inside and out with a soft cloth that has been dampened slightly with spirits of wine to remove the faint haze of oil vapor and combustion products. The cloth is worked gently around the interior of the cylinder, using a wooden dowel to reach the full depth of the glass, and the exterior is polished with the same care that is applied to the prisms of the lens. The chimney is then replaced and the flame is observed to ensure that the cleaning has not disturbed the alignment or introduced any smears that might distort the light. The brass components of the lamp receive their own share of attention during the night watch, and you take up a rag that has been designated for this purpose and work it over the surface of the reservoir and the burner assembly and the bracket that supports the lamp within the lens. The brass is warm from the heat of the flame, and it responds readily to the polishing, acquiring a soft gleam that reflects the amber light and contributes to the overall brightness of the lantern room. The polishing of the lamp is a smaller task than the polishing of the lens, but it is no less important because a clean lamp produces a clean flame, and a clean flame produces a clear beam, and the chain of consequences extends outward from this small brass reservoir to the ships that are navigating the stormy waters 14 miles from the shelter of Plymouth Sound. The flame itself is a thing that rewards close observation, and during the quiet hours of the night watch, when the polishing is complete and the wick is trimmed and the oil level is adequate, there is nothing to do but watch the light and listen to the storm and wait for the dawn. The flame of the argand lamp is not the turbulent flickering thing that rises from a common candle or a simple wick, but a steady-shaped tongue of white gold that burns with a quiet intensity and fills the interior of the lens with its radiance. The flame has a structure that can be discerned by the attentive eye, a bright inner cone where the combustion is most complete, surrounded by a fainter outer envelope where the gases mix with the air and complete their transformation into heat and light. The inner cone is almost colorless at its base, where the oxygen supply is richest, and it shades upward into a soft yellow that is the color of the light that passes through the prisms and reaches out across the sea. The sound of the lamp is a soft hiss that is barely audible beneath the roar of the storm, but which can be heard when the ear is placed close to the burner, the sound of the air being drawn upward through the central tube, and the flame consuming the oil vapor in its steady, silent combustion. The hiss is a reassuring sound because it indicates that the draft is functioning properly and that the flame is receiving the oxygen it requires to burn clean and bright. A change in the sound would be noticed immediately and would prompt an inspection of the air passages and the chimney and the ventilating cowl above. But tonight the hiss is steady and unchanging, and the flame burns on without any need for intervention. The heat from the lamp is a presence that fills the lantern room and creates a pocket of warmth within the cold granite tower, a warmth that is most welcome during the long hours of the night watch when the wind outside drives the chill through every gap and seam. The heat rises from the flame and from the warm brass of the reservoir, and it flows upward through the copper funnel and into the ventilating cowl. But a portion of it radiates outward into the room and warms the air and the surfaces that surround the lens. You feel the warmth on your face and on your hands when you stand close to the lamp, and it is a comfort that makes the watch more bearable and the work of polishing more pleasant than it would otherwise be. The lamp requires nothing more from you during this watch, because the wick is trimmed and the chimney is clean, and the oil is sufficient, and the flame is burning with the steady, bright character that is the mark of a properly maintained argand burner. You settle onto the wooden stool near the clockwork mechanism, where you can observe the lamp and the lens, and the barometer, while the storm continues to rage outside, and the tower continues to tremble, and the sea continues to pound against the reef. The care of the lamp is complete for now, but it will be required again during the next watch, and the watch after that, because the flame never sleeps, and the light never rests, and the keeper's duty is a circle that has no end. The salt that rides the wind during a great storm on the Eddystone rocks is not the coarse white crystals that gather in the bottom of a sea chest or crust upon the rigging of a ship at anchor. It is a finer thing altogether, a mist so subtle that it passes through the narrowest gaps and the tightest seams as if it were made of something less than matter. A presence that fills the air and coats every surface with a film that is barely visible to the eye, but which works its slow corrosion upon brass and steel and iron with the patience of the tide. The lantern room is sealed as well as human hands can seal it, with iron frames bedded in putty and glass panes set into grooves that have been packed with oakum and painted over with many coats of lead-based paint. Yet the salt finds its way inside nonetheless. It comes through the small gaps around the ventilating cowl, where the roof lead meets the iron collar, and it comes through the joints between the granite blocks that form the walls, and it comes through the very air that is drawn into the room to feed the lamp and the keepers who tend it. The veil of salt is a phrase that the older keepers used to describe this invisible accumulation, And it is an apt description because the film that settles on the interior surfaces has the quality of a fine gauze, a faint dulling of the brightness that would otherwise characterize the brass fittings and the steel tools and the glass panes themselves. The film is not obvious in the way that a spill of oil or a smear of rouge is obvious, and a visitor to the lantern room on a calm day might not notice it at all unless they ran a finger across a brass hinge and observed the slight discoloration that transferred to the skin. But the trained eye of the keeper can detect it immediately as a softening of the reflections and a muting of the gleam that is the proper condition of a well-maintained lighthouse. The salt film is the quiet enemy of the polished brass and the bright steel, and it must be addressed during every watch with the same regularity that is applied to the lens and the lamp. You have completed the polishing of the prisms and the buffing with the chamois leather, and the lens now rotates in its silent circle, with a clarity that is the result of the night's careful labor. The lamp burns with its steady white gold flame, and the wick is trimmed and the oil level is adequate, and the beam reaches out across the stormy water with the full power that the Fresnel system can provide. The work of this watch is not yet complete, however, because the salt film continues to settle even as you stand in the lantern room, and the brass and the steel and the glass require a different kind of attention if they are to resist the slow corrosion that the sea air brings. The interior of the lantern room glass must be wiped down, and the metal fittings must be coated with a thin protective film of oil, and the tools must be inspected and treated with the same care that is given to every other component of the lighthouse. The cloth that you use for this purpose is different from the soft cotton rags that are reserved for the polishing of the lens. It is a piece of heavy linen that has been saturated with a mixture of spermaceti oil and a small amount of beeswax dissolved in spirits of turpentine, a preparation that dries to a thin waxy film that repels moisture and prevents the salt from making direct contact with the metal surface. The cloth is kept in a small tin box with a tight-fitting lid to prevent the evaporation of the solvents, and it carries a distinctive smell that is both sweet and sharp, the clean scent of the turpentine mingling with the rich odor of the oil and the faint honey note of the beeswax. The cloth is slightly tacky to the touch, and it leaves a faint sheen on the fingers, a sheen that must be wiped away with a dry rag before handling the lens or the lamp, because any transfer of oil to the optical surfaces would create a haze that would require additional polishing to remove. The interior of the lantern room glass is the first surface to receive this protective treatment, and you begin the work at the pane that faces roughly southwest into the teeth of the storm. The glass is cold to the touch despite the warmth of the lamp, and it vibrates with a high frequency that you can feel through the cloth as a faint buzzing against your fingertips. The salt film on the interior surface is barely visible, but it is there nonetheless, and it appears as a slight cloudiness when you breathe upon the glass and observe the pattern of the condensation. The oily cloth is passed over the entire surface of the pane in long, smooth strokes that cover the glass from top to bottom and from edge to edge, leaving behind a transparent film that is invisible to the eye, but which can be felt as a slight slickness when the finger is drawn across it. The film will protect the glass not from the salt itself because the glass is impervious to corrosion, but from the moisture that carries the salt, and which would otherwise condense on the cold surface and drip down onto the brass fittings below. The iron frames that hold the glass panes in place are the next surfaces to receive attention, and they present a more complex geometry of corners and edges and overlapping joints where the salt film tends to accumulate in greater thickness. The frames are painted with many coats of black paint that is formulated to resist the marine environment, but the paint is not a perfect barrier, and the salt finds its way into the small cracks and crevices where the metal is exposed. The oily cloth is worked into these narrow spaces with a careful pressure that forces the protective film into the gaps and coats the hidden surfaces that cannot be seen, but which are nonetheless vulnerable to the slow rust that would eventually weaken the frames and compromise the seal that keeps the weather out. The cloth leaves a faint sheen on the black paint that catches the amber light of the lamp and gives the frames a subtle luster that is the mark of proper maintenance. The brass hinges that support the lower panes of the lantern glass are particularly susceptible to the effects of the salt because they are located near the floor where the damp settles, and because they are subject to the mechanical wear of opening and closing during the occasional calm days when the glass is swung inward to allow the keepers access to the exterior for cleaning. The hinges are heavy castings of brass that have been fitted with steel pins, and the combination of two different metals in the presence of salt moisture creates the conditions for galvanic corrosion that can seize the hinge and make it impossible to move. The oily cloth is applied with particular care to these hinges, and the protective film is worked into the joint between the moving parts with a back and forth motion that ensures the oil penetrates to the bearing surfaces. The brass responds to the treatment by taking on a deeper, richer color, and the faint squeak that had begun to develop in one of the hinges is silenced by the lubrication. The copper ventilation tubes that carry fresh air from the exterior to the lamp and that carry the products of combustion upward to the cowl in the roof are also subject to the accumulation of salt film, and they require the same protective treatment as the other metal surfaces in the lantern room. The tubes are located in the corners of the room where they run from floor to ceiling, and they are accessible only by reaching around the lens assembly and the pedestal, a position that requires some contortion of the body, but which is familiar from countless previous watches. The copper has a warm reddish-brown color that is different from the yellow of the brass, and it develops a greenish patina over time. If it is not protected from the salt, a patina that is beautiful in its way, but which indicates that the metal is being slowly consumed by the reaction with the sea air. The oily cloth is passed over the surface of the tubes with a firm pressure that leaves a thin film behind, and the copper gleams with a soft warmth that reflects the light of the lamp. The steel tools that are kept in the lantern room for the maintenance of the lamp and the lens must also be protected from the salt, because they are made of a metal that rusts more readily than brass or copper, and a rusted tool is a tool that cannot be relied upon when it is needed. The small brass scissors that are used for trimming the wick are stored in a leather sheath that has been treated with oil, and the blades are wiped with the oily cloth after each use to prevent the formation of rust spots on the cutting edges. The wooden-handled screwdrivers and the brass keys that operate the various adjustments on the lamp and the clockwork are wiped down as well, and the steel shafts are coated with the protective film before being returned to their places in the small rack that is mounted on the wall near the door. The tools gleam softly in the amber light, and they are ready for use at any moment, a readiness that is the result of the same careful attention that is given to every other aspect of the lighthouse. The storm outside has continued to build during the time you have been attending to the interior surfaces, and the waves that break against the reef are now large enough that heavy spray is thrown against the lantern glass with increasing frequency. The spray is a solid curtain of white water that obscures the view and makes the interior of the room seem darker for a moment, before the light reasserts itself and the water drains away down the exterior of the panes. The impact of the spray against the glass produces a sound, like a heavy cloth being snapped in the wind, and the panes vibrate in their frames with a force that can be felt through the floor. The salt that is carried in this spray is far more concentrated than the fine mist that normally fills the air, and it leaves a thick white crust on the exterior of the glass that cannot be cleaned until the weather moderates and the keepers can venture outside onto the gallery. The crust reduces the transmission of the light by a small amount, but the beam is still bright enough to serve its purpose, and the ships at sea will see the flash of the Eddystone through the storm, despite the salt on the glass. The interior of the lantern room glass is now protected by the thin film of oil and beeswax, and the metal fittings have received their share of attention, and the tools have been wiped and returned to their rack. The work of combating the veil of salt is a task that never ends, because the salt continues to arrive with every gust of wind and every breath of the sea, and the protective film will need to be renewed during the next watch and the watch after that. The cycle of accumulation and removal and protection is as endless as the cycle of the tides, and it is accepted as part of the duty without complaint or resentment, because the alternative is the slow decay of the lighthouse and the gradual failure of the light that the ships at sea depend upon. The oily cloth is returned to its tin box, and the lid is pressed down firmly to seal the contents against the evaporation of the solvents. The box is placed on the shelf near the door where it will be ready for the next keeper who needs it, and the smell of the turpentine and the oil lingers in the air for a few moments before it is carried away by the draught from the ventilating cowl. The lantern room is now in a state of proper maintenance, and every surface that can be protected has been protected, and every fitting that can be lubricated has been lubricated, and the light continues to shine through the storm with the steady 4-minute rhythm that identifies the Eddystone to the ships that pass this way. The veil of salt is a patient enemy, and it will return within hours to begin its slow work anew. But for now, The tower is defended against it, and the brass and the steel and the iron are safe beneath their thin, protective films. You settle onto the wooden stool near the clockwork mechanism, and you watch the lens rotate, and you listen to the storm, and you feel the tower tremble beneath the impact of the waves. The salt will continue to fall from the air, and it will settle on every surface, and it will begin to dull the gleam that you have worked to maintain. But that is a concern for the next watch, and the next keeper, and the long, slow cycle of maintenance that defines life on the Eddystone rocks. The sea is so high now that the spray against the lantern glass is nearly continuous, and the view through the salt-streaked panes is a shifting abstraction of white and grey and black that conveys nothing of the actual sea state except its general violence. The tower shudders with each heavy impact of the larger waves, and the groan of the rock continues its deep bass rumble beneath the other sounds of the storm. The ventilating cowl creaks as it turns to face the shifting wind, and the clockwork ticks with its steady metronomic beat, and the lamp hisses softly as it consumes the oil and produces the light that is the purpose of all this labor. The protective film on the interior glass does nothing to improve the view through the salt-crusted exterior panes, but that is not its purpose. Its purpose is to prevent the condensation that forms on the warm interior surface from combining with the salt dust in the air and dripping down onto the brass fittings below, where it would accelerate the corrosion that is the constant enemy of the lighthouse. The film is invisible, and it performs its function without any visible sign of its presence, and this invisibility is characteristic of the most important work that is done in the lantern room. The polishing of the lens produces a visible result, and the trimming of the wick produces a visible improvement in the flame. But the wiping of the interior glass with the oily cloth produces no change that the eye can detect, and yet it is as essential as any other task that the keeper performs. The hours of the night watch continue to pass, and the storm shows no sign of diminishing, and the veil of salt continues to settle on every surface despite the protective measures that have been taken. The salt is patient and the sea is endless, and the work of the keeper is never truly finished because the conditions that require the work are never truly absent. The tower stands against the storm, and the light shines through the darkness, and the ships at sea see the flash of the Eddystone and adjust their courses according, and this is the purpose that justifies all the small repetitive tasks that fill the hours of the watch. The wiping of the glass, and the oiling of the brass, and the inspection of the tools are not ends in themselves, but means to the greater end of maintaining the light that guides the mariner home. You rise from the stool after a time to check the oil level in the lamp, and to observe the flame and to ensure that the lens continues its silent rotation on the mercury float. The lamp burns with its steady white gold flame, and the oil is sufficient for the remaining hours of darkness, and the lens turns with its perfect 4-minute rhythm. The interior glass gleams faintly where the light catches the thin film of oil, and the brass fittings glow with a soft, warm luster, and the tools rest in their rack, ready for the next task that will require them. The veil of salt has been pushed back for another watch, and the tower is defended against the slow corrosion of the sea, and the work of the night continues in its quiet, unending cycle. The hours of the night watch pass without remark in the world outside the tower, but inside the lantern room they are measured by the slow rotation of the Fresnel lens and the steady descent of the clockwork weight and the gradual consumption of the oil in the argand lamp. Time on the Eddystone rocks during a great storm is not the same substance that flows through the streets of Plymouth or the drawing rooms of London, where clocks strike the hours and people move through their days according to schedules determined by commerce and society. Time here is a circle rather than a line, and it is marked by the repetition of tasks that must be performed at regular intervals regardless of the conditions outside. A rhythm that has continued without interruption since the tower was first lit, and will continue long after the present watch has ended and the present keeper has been replaced by another. You have been on watch for several hours now, and the work of polishing the lens and trimming the wick and protecting the metal surfaces from the salt film is complete. The lantern room is in a state of proper order, and the beam sweeps across the invisible sea with its steady 4-minute rhythm, a rhythm that has become so familiar that you no longer consciously notice its passage, though some part of your mind continues to track it and would alert you immediately if the interval were to change. The lamp burns with its steady white gold flame, and the oil level descends by slow increments that you check at regular intervals. a routine that requires no conscious thought because the body knows when to rise from the stool and approach the lamp and read the float gauge by the light of the hand lantern. The clockwork ticks in the service room below, and the sound travels up through the pedestal and into the floor of the lantern room, where it provides a quiet, metronomic accompaniment to the roar of the storm. The small wooden stool near the mechanism has become a familiar place during the hours of this watch, and you have settled into a posture that balances alertness with rest, the back straight but not rigid, and the hands folded in the lap, and the eyes directed toward the lens without really seeing it. The mind in this state is neither fully awake nor approaching sleep, but occupies a middle ground where thoughts arise and pass away without demanding attention, and where the passage of time becomes a gentle current that carries the watch forward toward the dawn. The storm outside provides a constant background of sound that fills the lantern room and wraps around the consciousness like a blanket, a presence that is so continuous and so all-encompassing that it ceases after a while to register as noise and becomes instead a kind of silence, a deep sustained note against which the smaller sounds of the tower interior stand out with sharp clarity. The winding of the clockwork mechanism is a task that must be performed several times during the night watch, and you rise from the stool at the appointed hour to attend to this duty. The weight that drives the rotation of the lens descends slowly in its shaft, and when it reaches a certain point, marked by a red line painted on the wall of the service room, the crank must be turned to raise it back to the top of its travel. The crank is a heavy iron handle that fits onto a square shaft projecting from the side of the clockwork frame, and the act of turning it requires a certain amount of physical effort because of the mechanical advantage that has been designed into the gear train. The motion is a rhythmic back and forth of the arms and shoulders that occupies the body while the mind remains free to wander, and the sound of the crank is a series of clicks as the pawl engages with the ratchet wheel, each click corresponding to a small increment of lift applied to the weight. The winding takes several minutes to complete, and during this time you are aware of the principal keeper resting in the quarters below, a presence that is felt rather than seen or heard, a shared understanding that requires no words to maintain. The two of you have spent many watches together in this tower, and you have learned to read each other's movements and silences with a precision that comes from long familiarity. The principal keeper will wake in a few hours and climb the stairs to relieve you, and the routine will continue as it has, through every storm that has tested the Eddystone, a cycle of waking and sleeping and working that is determined by the needs of the light rather than the preferences of the keepers. The relationship between the two men who share the duty on the rock station is a particular kind of companionship that exists nowhere else, a bond formed by shared isolation and shared purpose, and the quiet acceptance that each depends upon the other for the successful performance of the work. The winding is complete, and the weight hangs once more at the top of the shaft, and the clockwork resumes its steady ticking. You return to the lantern room and settle onto the stool, and the watch continues its slow turn toward the dawn. The lens rotates on its mercury float with a silent precision that never fails to seem remarkable, and the beam sweeps across the darkness with a regularity that has not faltered since the tower was first lit. The storm outside has neither increased nor diminished during the time you were below, and it continues to rage with a sustained intensity that speaks of a disturbance of great size and energy, a weather system that will be remembered in the annals of the coast for the damage it causes and the ships it drives onto the shore. But here on the Eddystone rocks, the storm is simply the condition under which the work is performed, and it is accepted without drama or excitement, a fact of the environment, like the salt in the air and the vibration of the tower. The particular loneliness of the assistant keeper's role during a great gale is not the loneliness of isolation from all human contact, because the principal keeper sleeps in the quarters below, and his presence is a comfort even when he is not visible. It is rather the loneliness of the watch itself, the hours of darkness when one person alone tends the light and the other rests, a division of labor that is necessary for the sustained operation of the lighthouse, but which creates long stretches of solitude that must be filled with something other than conversation. The mind learns to occupy itself with small observations and quiet reflections, and the slow examination of the details that make up the interior world of the lantern room. The way the light catches the edge of a brass ring and creates a line of golden brightness that moves as the lens rotates. The pattern of condensation on the interior of the glass panes, and the way the droplets merge and run down to collect in the copper channels. The faint variations in the sound of the wind as it shifts through small angles and finds new paths around the gallery and through the iron framework. These small things become the companions of the watch, and they fill the hours with a gentle interest that requires no effort to sustain. The shared understanding between the keepers extends beyond the practical matters of oil levels and wick trimming and winding schedules, to include an unspoken agreement about the nature of the duty that has brought them to this remote rock in the midst of the sea. Neither man speaks of it directly because such things are not spoken of in the close quarters of a lighthouse, where words must be chosen with care to avoid the friction that can develop between people who cannot escape each other's company. The understanding is there nonetheless, and it informs every action and every silence and every small courtesy that makes the shared life possible. The principal keeper will have prepared a pot of something warm before retiring to his berth, and he will have left it on the stove where it will remain until you descend at the end of your watch. You will have trimmed the wick and polished the lens and wound the clockwork, so that when he relieves you, the lantern room will be in proper order, and the light will be burning as it should. These small exchanges of care are the currency of life on the rock, and they accumulate over time into a relationship that is deeper than friendship and more durable than the ordinary bonds of acquaintance. The hours continue to pass and the darkness outside remains complete and unbroken by any hint of the approaching dawn. The storm has settled into a steady condition, and the wind maintains a constant force that keeps the sea in a state of continuous violent motion without the peaks and lulls that characterize lesser gales. The waves that break against the reef are large enough that the spray reaches the lantern glass with every surge, and the salt crust on the exterior panes has grown thick enough to reduce the transmission of the light by a noticeable amount. Though the beam is still bright enough to serve its purpose, the tower shudders with a long, slow rhythm that has become so familiar that it no longer registers as movement, but rather as a constant condition of the environment, like the pressure of the air or the pull of gravity. The rotation of the lens is a thing that can be observed in different ways depending on the focus of the attention. If you watch the fixed mark on the floor and observe the passage of the brass carriage past that reference point, the motion is almost imperceptibly slow, and it requires patience to detect the progress of the 4-minute cycle. If you watch the beam itself as it sweeps across the interior of the lantern room, the motion is more apparent because the light illuminates different portions of the walls and the ceiling in a repeating sequence that creates a gentle pulse of brightness and shadow. If you close your eyes and simply feel the presence of the lens, the rotation becomes a kind of breathing, a slow exhalation of light that reaches out across the water and then returns to the tower to begin the cycle again. The lens is a silent metronome of safety, and its rhythm is the heartbeat of the Eddystone, and the keeper who tends it becomes attuned to this rhythm in a way that is difficult to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. The barometer on the wall of the service room has stabilized at a very low reading, and it no longer shows any sign of falling further, an indication that the storm has reached its maximum intensity and will likely maintain this condition for some hours before beginning its slow decline. The knowledge that the worst of the weather is occurring now, rather than building towards some future peak, provides a certain comfort because it means that the watch is being kept during the most demanding portion of the storm and that the conditions will not worsen beyond what they are at present. The tower has withstood the assault thus far, and the light has continued to shine, and the lens has continued to rotate, and the lamp has continued to burn, and these facts together constitute a quiet victory over the forces that are arrayed against the lighthouse. The stool near the mechanism is not the only place where you sit during the long hours of the watch. There is a small wooden bench against the wall near the door that provides a different perspective on the lantern room and a different arrangement of the body, the back supported by the granite blocks and the legs stretched out before you. From this position you can see the lamp and the lens, and the barometer and the door that leads to the spiral stairs and the small window that faces roughly east where the dawn will eventually appear as a lightening of the grey that fills the panes. The bench is hard and unyielding, but it offers a change from the stool, and the change itself is a small refreshment that helps to maintain the alertness required for the watch. The mind in this position drifts toward thoughts of the wider world beyond the tower, the world of towns and farms and people going about their ordinary lives, unaware of the storm that is raging over the sea and the two men who tend the light on the Eddystone rocks. The isolation of the lighthouse is a condition that shapes every aspect of life on the rock, and it creates a particular perspective on the human world that is difficult to maintain when one returns to the shore. From the lantern room of the Eddystone, the concerns of the land seem distant and abstract, matters that belong to another realm of existence that has little connection to the immediate realities of wind and water and light. The political debates and the commercial transactions and the social rivalries that occupy the attention of people in the towns and cities appear as small things when viewed from a tower that stands alone in the midst of the sea, a tower that will continue to stand and to shine regardless of what happens in the world of human affairs. The keeper who has spent enough time on the rock acquires a certain detachment from these matters, not a lack of interest, but a sense of proportion that places them in their proper relation to the larger forces that govern the natural world. The slow turn of the watch is also a turn toward the end of the darkness and the arrival of the grey light that will signal the completion of the night's duty. The dawn is still some hours away, but the knowledge that it will come is a comfort that sustains the keeper through the deepest portion of the night, when the body's rhythms call most insistently for sleep, and the mind must make a conscious effort to remain alert. The light of the lamp is a constant presence that helps to maintain wakefulness, because it fills the lantern room with a warm amber radiance that counters the darkness outside and reminds the keeper of the purpose that justifies the long hours of solitude. The flame is a living thing that requires attention and care, and its presence is a companion that shares the watch and makes the loneliness bearable. The principal keeper will wake soon, and the sounds of his movement in the quarters below will provide a welcome indication that the watch is drawing toward its close. He will light the small lantern that he keeps by his berth, and he will dress in the warm clothing required for the lantern room, and he will climb the spiral stairs with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who has made that climb thousands of times and knows every step by the feel of the stone under his boots. You will hear his approach as a series of small sounds that rise through the tower. The creak of the door below, and the soft scuff of his boots on the granite, and the faint jingle of the keys that he carries on a ring at his belt. The sounds will grow louder as he ascends, and you will rise from the bench or the stool to meet him at the door of the lantern room, and the watch will be exchanged with a few quiet words that convey the essential information about the state of the light and the weather and the oil. The exchange of the watch is a ritual that has been performed on the Eddystone rocks since the tower was first lit, and it follows a pattern that is familiar to every keeper who has served on a rock station. The keeper who is being relieved reports the condition of the lamp and the lens in the clockwork, and notes any changes in the weather that have occurred during the watch. The keeper who is taking over acknowledges the report and asks any questions that occur to him, and then the first keeper descends the stairs to the quarters below, where a warm meal and a berth await. The ritual is simple, unpractical, and it contains within it a recognition of the shared duty that binds the two men together in their isolation. The light passes from one pair of hands to another, and the watch continues without interruption, and the ships at sea continue to see the flash of the Eddystone and to adjust their courses accordingly. The slow turn of the watch is nearly complete, and the grey light of dawn is beginning to appear above the eastern horizon, though the storm still rages and the sea still pounds against the reef and the wind still howls around the gallery. The light outside is a thin pewter colour that barely penetrates the salt-crusted glass, but it is enough to signal the end of the night and the beginning of the day watch. The lamp will continue to burn until the daylight is sufficient for the light to be extinguished and the oil conserved for the coming night. But for now, it still glows at the heart of the Fresnel lens, and the beam still sweeps across the water with its steady 4-minute rhythm. The assistant keeper's watch is ending, and the principal keeper's watch is beginning, and the circle of duty continues its slow, unending rotation, like the lens itself turning on its bath of mercury. You gather the few items that belong to you, and you take a last look at the lamp and the lens and the barometer before descending the spiral stairs to the quarters below. The storm will continue through the day and into the next night, and perhaps the night after that, but the tower will stand and the light will shine and the keepers will maintain their watch. The slow turn of the hours has brought you to the end of this particular duty and the beginning of a period of rest, and the cycle will repeat again when darkness falls and you climb the stairs once more to tend the light on the Eddystone rocks. The grey light that seeps through the salt-crusted glass of the lantern room is not the sudden brightening that announces a clear winter dawn, but a gradual paling of the darkness that occurs so slowly the eye cannot detect the moment of change. One simply becomes aware after a time that the black beyond the panes has softened to a deep charcoal, and then to a dark slate, and finally to the heavy pewter tone that passes for daylight during a great storm on the Eddystone rocks. The beam of the Fresnel lens continues to sweep across the water with its steady 4-minute rhythm, but the contrast between the yellow radiance and the surrounding gloom has diminished, and the light no longer seems to cut through the darkness with the same sharp definition that it possessed during the deepest hours of the night. The lamp still burns at the heart of the assembly, and the prisms still gather its glow and send it outward across the heaving sea. But the edge of the beam is softer now, and it merges more gently with the grey that fills the world beyond the glass. The storm has not ended in any sense that a landsman would recognize as an ending, because the wind still howls around the gallery, and the sea still pounds against the reef, and the tower still trembles with each heavy impact of the larger waves. But there has been a change in the character of the weather that the experienced ear can detect as a subtle shift in the sound of the wind and a slight lengthening of the intervals between the most violent gusts. The barometer in the service room has begun to rise by fractions of an inch, a movement so small that it is barely visible on the scale, but which indicates that the low-pressure system which has dominated the western approaches for the past 2 days is finally beginning to move away toward the east and the continent beyond. The storm will continue for many hours yet, and the sea will remain dangerous, and the ships that navigate these waters will still require the guidance of the Eddystone light. But the worst of the gale has passed, and the long, slow process of recovery has begun. You have been on watch through the final hours of the night, and the work of polishing the Fresnel lens is nearly complete for this cycle of duty. The upper prisms and the central bull's-eye panel and the lower warning prisms have all received their share of attention, and the rouge paste has been applied and dried and removed with the chamois leather in the sequence that has become as familiar as breathing. The glass surfaces gleam with a particular transparency that is the mark of proper maintenance, and the brass fittings glow with a soft, warm luster that catches the amber light of the lamp. The lens rotates on its mercury, float with a silent precision that never fails to seem remarkable, and the beam reaches out across the stormy water with the full power that the Argand lamp and the Fresnel optics can provide. The work of this watch is drawing toward its close, and only a few small tasks remain before the principal keeper climbs the stairs to relieve you, and the cycle of duty continues its slow, unending turn. The final buffing of the lens is a task that requires a light touch and a patient hand, because the dried rouge must be removed without leaving any marks or smears that would scatter the light and reduce the clarity of the beam. The chamois leather is taken from its tin box for the last time during this watch, and you pass it over the surfaces of the prisms with a gentle wiping motion that picks up the faint pink haze and leaves the glass absolutely clear. The leather glides over the curved bull's-eye panel with a soft squeaking sound that indicates perfect cleanliness, and it reaches into the narrow spaces between the upper prisms where the brass frames create shadows and angles. The lower prisms receive the same attention, and you kneel on the wooden deck to buff the angled glass elements that direct light downward toward the reef, a position that has become familiar through many repetitions, and which brings with it the quiet satisfaction of work nearing completion. The lamp requires a final inspection before the watch is exchanged, and you observe the flame through the clean glass chimney, noting the steady white gold color and the absence of any smoke or flicker that would indicate a problem with the wick or the draft. The wick was trimmed during the middle hours of the night, and it still burns with a clean, even edge that produces the maximum light from the oil consumed. The oil level in the reservoir is adequate for the remaining hours of daylight, though the lamp will be extinguished soon after the principal keeper takes over, because the grey light outside is now sufficient for the beam to be discontinued until darkness falls again. The float gauge shows a reading that you note without conscious calculation, because the information is simply part of the overall awareness of the state of the light that develops during a watch, a sense of the condition of every component that requires no deliberate thought to maintain. The interior of the lantern room glass has been wiped with the oily cloth, and the thin protective film that repels moisture and prevents the accumulation of salt on the metal fittings is in place. The brass hinges and the copper ventilation tubes and the steel tools in their rack have all received their share of attention, and the lantern room is in a state of proper order that reflects the care which has been applied during the hours of darkness. The veil of salt will return within hours to begin its slow work anew, because the sea air never ceases its patient assault on the materials that human hands have assembled here. But for now the tower is defended, and the light shines clear, and the duty of the assistant keeper is discharged. The sounds of the tower have changed with the shifting of the storm, and the groan of the rock is not as deep or as continuous as it was during the peak of the gale. The waves still break against the reef with considerable force, and the spray still reaches the lantern glass with many of the larger surges, but the frequency of the heaviest impacts has diminished, and the tower trembles with a slower, more regular rhythm that speaks of a sea beginning to settle toward its normal winter condition. The wind still howls around the gallery, but its voice has dropped from a shriek to a sustained roar, and there are now perceptible lulls between the gusts. Moments when the pressure eases slightly and the glass panes cease their high-frequency vibration. The ventilating cowl creaks as it turns to face the shifting wind, and the clockwork ticks with its steady metronomic beat, and the lamp hisses softly as it consumes the oil and produces the light that is the purpose of all this labor. The view through the salt-crusted exterior panes has improved slightly as the wind-driven spray has begun to wash some of the accumulation from the glass, a process that will continue through the day until the keepers can venture outside onto the gallery and clean the panes properly with fresh water and soft cloths. The world beyond the glass is still a shifting abstraction of grey and white and black, but there are now moments when the eye can discern the heaving surface of the sea and the white crests of the waves and the dark shape of the reef where the water breaks in explosions of foam. The sky above remains a uniform grey ceiling that presses down upon the water without any break or variation, but the quality of the light has changed from the absolute darkness of the storm's peak to a diffuse illumination that reveals the contours of the sea and the movement of the clouds. The stool near the clockwork mechanism has been your companion through the long hours of this watch, and you settle onto it for the final time before the principal keeper arrives. The wood is hard and unyielding, but it has shaped itself to your form over the course of the night, and the position is comfortable enough for these last few minutes of duty. The lens rotates in its silent circle, and the beam sweeps across the grey water, and the grey sky and the grey rock, where the sea continues its ancient assault on the granite that has resisted it for millennia. The lamp burns with its steady white-gold flame, and the oil descends by slow increments in the reservoir, and the clockwork ticks in the service room below. The sounds of the storm wrap around the tower like a blanket, and the mind drifts in the quiet space between alertness and rest that is characteristic of the end of a night watch. The fading grey of the storm's decline is a condition that invites a particular kind of reflection, because it marks not an ending, but a transition, a movement from one state of weather to another that contains within it the memory of the violence that has passed, and the anticipation of the calm that will eventually follow. The storm of 1824 will be remembered in the annals of the coast for the damage it caused, and the ships it drove onto the shore, and the lives it claimed in the towns and villages that faced the sea. But here on the Eddystone rocks, the storm is simply one of many that have tested this tower since it was first built, and it will be followed by others in the years to come, a procession of gales and tempests that will continue for as long as the Atlantic sends its weather toward the shores of Devon and Cornwall. The tower will stand, and the light will shine, and the keepers will maintain their watch through all of it, because that is what towers and lights and keepers do. The principal keeper will climb the stairs soon, and you will hear his approach as a series of small sounds that rise through the tower, the creak of the door below and the soft scuff of his boots on the granite and the faint jingle of the keys at his belt. He will appear at the door of the lantern room with the calm expression of a man who has rested through the storm and is ready to take up the duty for the daylight hours. The two of you will exchange a few quiet words about the state of the light and the weather and the oil, and then you will descend the spiral stairs to the quarters below where a warm meal and a berth await. The cycle of the watch will continue as it has through every storm that has tested this tower, and the light will pass from one pair of hands to another without interruption or ceremony. The rotation of the lens on its mercury float is a thing that will continue long after you have descended the stairs and settled into your berth and closed your eyes against the grey light that fills the lower rooms. The clockwork will tick, and the weight will descend, and the beam will sweep across the water with its steady 4-minute rhythm until the daylight is sufficient for the lamp to be extinguished and the oil conserved for the coming night. The storm will continue to diminish through the day, and the sea will begin to settle toward its normal winter condition, and the ships that have been sheltering in Plymouth Sound will venture out once more to continue their voyages along the coast. The Eddystone light will guide them as it has guided countless ships before, and as it will guide countless ships in the years to come, because the tower stands and the lens turns and the keepers keep their watch. The last of the buffing is complete, and the chamois leather has been returned to its tin box, and the rags have been folded and placed in the basket for washing when the weather permits a trip to the lower landing stage. The jar of rouge powder sits on its shelf with the cork stopper pressed firmly into place, and the bottle of spirits of wine stands beside it, with its ground glass stopper sealing the contents against evaporation. The oily cloth has been returned to its own tin box, and the tools have been wiped and placed in their rack, and the lantern room is in a state of proper order that will greet the principal keeper when he arrives. The work of the night watch is finished, and only the waiting remains, the quiet interval between the completion of the tasks and the arrival of the relief. The grey light outside continues to strengthen by imperceptible degrees, and the beam of the Fresnel lens grows fainter against the brightening sky. The lamp still burns at the heart of the assembly, and the flame still produces its steady white-gold radiance. But the contrast that made the light so visible during the darkness has diminished, and the beam now seems to merge with the grey of the morning rather than cutting through it. The time for the lamp to be extinguished is approaching, and the principal keeper will attend to that task when he judges that the daylight is sufficient for the light to be discontinued. The oil that remains in the reservoir will be conserved for the coming night, and the wick will be trimmed, and the chimney will be cleaned, and the lamp will be prepared for the next watch, and the next storm, and the next storm, and the next cycle of darkness and light. You rise from the stool as the sounds of the principal keeper's approach reach your ears, and you move to the door of the lantern room to meet him. The exchange of the watch is brief and quiet, and it contains within it the recognition of the shared duty that has brought both men to this remote rock in the midst of the sea. You report the condition of the lamp and the lens and the clockwork, and you note that the barometer is rising and the wind is beginning to moderate, though the sea remains dangerous and the spray continues to reach the lantern glass. The principal keeper nods and asks a question about the oil level, and you answer, and then the watch is his, and you are free to descend the spiral stairs to the quarters below. The spiral stairs are the same stairs you have climbed and descended countless times during your service on the Eddystone, and each step is known by the feel of the stone under your boots, and the sound that the iron railing makes when your hand slides along its length. The descent carries you down through the service room, where the clockwork ticks, and the weight hangs in its shaft, and down through the living quarters, where the stove radiates a gentle warmth, and the smell of something cooking rises from the pot on the back of the cooking surface. The principal keeper has prepared a meal in anticipation of your arrival, and it waits for you on the wooden table with a cup of tea steaming beside it. The food is simple and warm, and it served its purpose of restoring the energy that has been spent during the long hours of the night watch. The berth in the curved wall of the tower is waiting, and you settle into it with the familiar sensation of the thin mattress and the wool blankets that hold the faint smell of lanolin and the sea. The vibration of the tower is a gentle trembling that travels up through the stone and into the berth, and it rocks you with a slow rhythm that is the echo of the waves still breaking against the reef. The sound of the wind is muffled here in the lower rooms, and it has become a deep, sustained note that wraps around the consciousness and presses it gently downward toward rest. The storm will continue through the day and into the next night, but the light will shine, and the tower will stand, and the keepers will maintain their watch. The fading grey of the morning is the last thing you see before sleep comes, and it fills the small window with a diffuse illumination that is neither bright nor dark, but simply the light of a stormy day on the Eddystone rocks. The lamp in the lantern room above will be extinguished soon, and the lens will cease its rotation for the daylight hours, but it will be ready when darkness falls again, and the cycle of the watch will continue as it has through every storm that has tested this tower. The glass is clean, and the light is bright, and the tower stands, and that is enough.